1.
And then
This hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on the President's fiscal year 2023 budget. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I'll start by going over a few housekeeping matters. Today, the committee is holding a hybrid hearing. Members may participate remotely or in person. For individuals participating remotely, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. If you are participating remotely and are experiencing connectivity issues, please contact staff immediately so those issues can be resolved. Members participating in the hearing room or on the remote platform are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If you are participating remotely and I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. I'd like to remind members participating remotely in this proceeding to keep your camera on at all times, even if you are not under recognition by the chair. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. If you are on the remote platform and choose to participate in a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. Finally, we have established an inbox for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. Now, I will introduce our witness. This morning, we will be hearing from the Honorable Shalonda Young, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. And per our agreement with Director Young, the committee will recess briefly around noon and reconvene around 12:30 p.m. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, Director Young. I want to thank you for appearing before our committee today to testify on the President's fiscal year 2023 budget. I also want to congratulate you on your historic confirmation. We are honored to have you with us here today, and OMB is very lucky to have you at the helm. This month marked 2 years since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Since then, our nation experienced the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Families have lost their homes, their savings, their livelihoods, and their loved ones. When President Biden took office, the pace of vaccine distribution was dismal. There was no comprehensive plan to get shots into arms. There was an enormous gulf between what families and our economy needed and how the federal government was responding. That changed with the American Rescue Plan, which this committee was proud to lead. It kickstarted a mass vaccination campaign, reinvigorated our economy, and lifted millions of Americans out of poverty. Since the passage of the American Rescue Plan, the speed and strength of our recovery has blown past economists' expectations. 2021 was the greatest year of job growth in American history. During President Biden's first year in office, GDP grew at the fastest rate in nearly 4 decades. Unemployment has fallen to 3.8%, the fastest decline in recorded history. And the resurgence in worker power has led to wage increases across the board, with wages for low-income workers up the most. The President's budget request for 2023 takes the next steps toward achieving our shared goals. It provides a discretionary top line of nearly $1.6 trillion for annually funded programs, building on the enacted 2022 appropriations and continuing to reverse years of chronic underfunding. It's fiscally responsible and pro-growth investments in education, affordable housing, research and development, healthcare, and other vital priorities will not only better the lives of Americans today, but will strengthen our long-term economic outlook as well. This budget will expand the productive capacity of our economy and put money back in the pockets of the working Americans who power it. It will lower costs by fixing supply chains and increasing the amount of goods made here in America. It will cut energy costs for families while investing in climate science and innovation so we can tackle the climate crisis and lead in the clean energy economy. It will increase Pell Grants and provide more training and apprenticeships so all Americans have the opportunity to succeed in a 21st century economy. The President's budget is also a call to action on key areas of bipartisan consensus, tackling the mental health crisis, upholding our sacred obligation to our veterans, fighting the opioid epidemic, and investing in cutting-edge research to end cancer as we know it. We can afford to invest in the American people. Rather than handing tax cuts out to millionaires and billionaires, the Biden administration has outlined a new economic vision for America. Invest in America, educate the next generation of Americans, grow our workforce, and build the economy from the bottom up and middle out. This is how we meet the needs of families and communities. This is how we strengthen our recovery and grow our economy so that we build a better, stronger, more secure, and more inclusive nation for generations to come. And we pay for this new economic vision with long overdue reforms to make our tax code more equitable. This starts with making sure corporations and the richest Americans pay their fair share in taxes. The Biden budget raises the corporate tax rate to 28%, which, by the way, is still much lower than the 35% tax rate we had up until 2017. It's completely unacceptable that hardworking families often pay a higher tax rate than the wealthiest Americans. The president's budget fixes this by proposing a 20% minimum income tax on the very wealthiest households, worth more than $100 million. Together, these proposals will help rebalance our tax code to ensure it rewards work, not wealth. I'm optimistic that we can get this done. As we continue to work with our colleagues in the Senate to deliver a reconciliation bill to the president's desk, I'm eager to work on a 2023 budget and appropriations process that will deliver for the American people. Director Young, I look forward to your testimony today and hearing more from other administration officials in the coming weeks. Now I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, welcome back in person to the House Budget Committee, and congratulations on your confirmation. It was way overdue, and congratulations on your new child. A lot has happened in a year, so we're grateful you're here. When you testified last year on President Biden's fiscal year 22 budget, alarm bells were already going off about the impact that the president's agenda would have on the economy, what it would have on the inflation, and the security of our southern border. At that time, the crises created by President Biden and the House and Senate Democrats' agenda were already piling up. That list has only grown since, including an energy crisis, with folks paying over $4 a gallon at the pump. In fact, since President Biden has been in office, gas prices has went up 79%. That's tough for the folks back home. Then there's a crime crisis in communities across this country and an education crisis that has perpetuated the mistreatment of kids in our schools under the guise of COVID-19. So now we have President Biden's fiscal year 23 budget, a proposal that deliberately makes every crisis American families are facing because of President Biden and the one-party Democrat rule in Congress that much worse. American families are facing a spike in prices not seen in this country in over 40 years. A $3,500 inflation tax on every family in America just last year alone. The president's budget keeps the reckless spending going on, doubling down on the delusion that the answer out of inflation is to spend more money. This proposal spends $73 trillion over the next 10 years. And also, it provides the Build Back Broke agenda, which this budget tries to cover up using a deficit-neutral reserve fund. The Congressional Budget Office, though, has confirmed there is nothing deficit-neutral about the agenda. CBO confirmed it adds $3 trillion to our nation's debt. As gas prices have skyrocketed, the president's budget surrenders American energy independence and attacks American energy companies so that we are more reliant on foreign nations for our energy needs, more dependent on countries like Russia, China, and Venezuela, Iran. At a time when the world seems to be even more of a hostile place. This budget also includes potentially up to $4 trillion in tax increases, More than $1.5 trillion of that falling on American families. $2,000 for every average American tax increase is in this proposal. That is absolutely terrible. Then under the Build Back Better agenda, you have covered up in a deficit neutral reserve fund over the next 10 years. Biden's budget calls for $58 trillion in total taxes, the highest sustained tax burden in American history. And while folks see their taxes go up and the value of their paychecks go down, Biden's budget gives a 12% raise to the IRS to target hardworking Americans. We already know where this type of tax and spending agenda is going. Look at the past year after the Democrats' $2 trillion Biden bailout bill was signed into law. Jobs in 2021 grew less than CBO said they would before that $2 trillion spending bill came on the scene. After over 2.9 million border encounters occurred since Biden took office, the president's budget continues the same catch and release policies that have resulted in the worst border crisis in over 20 years. There's no commitment to border security in this budget, no using the $1.9 billion in border wall funding that was just renewed as part of the most recent omnibus spending bill. The budget allows $350 million in border wall still to continue rusting away, while contractors are paid billions to babysit unused material. It cuts funding for immigration and customs enforcement by $150 million. All of it is a slap in the face to the men and women dealing with security and humanitarian crisis at the southern border. The president says, "Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." For the second straight year, we see the president values a government that tells its citizens how to live their lives. He values an economy where everything from the clothes you put on your back to the food you put on your table to the gas in your car is more expensive. He values open borders and energy dependence. He values debt, a lot of it, $16 trillion to be exact. The American people are not going to buy this budget because, frankly, we can't afford it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member for his opening statement. In the interest of time, I ask that any other members who wish to make a statement submit their written statements for the record to the email inbox we established for receiving documents before and during committee proceedings. We have distributed that email address to your staff. I will hold the record open until the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I want to thank Director Young for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks, and you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee. It's so nice to be back to my old place of employment. Thank you for the opportunity to present the President's fiscal year 2023 budget. Under the President's leadership, our country has made historic progress in the face of unprecedented challenges. We created more than 6.5 million jobs in 2021, the most our country has recorded in a single year, ever. Our economy grew at 5.7%, the strongest growth in nearly 40 years. The unemployment rate has fallen to 3.8%, the fastest decline in recorded history. And the deficit is on track to drop by more than $1.3 trillion, the largest ever one-year decline. This progress was not on accident. It is a direct result of this president's strategy to combat the pandemic and grow our economy from the bottom up and the middle out. The president's 2023 budget details his vision to expand on that progress and deliver the agenda he laid out in his State of the Union to build a better America, reduce the deficit, reduce costs for families, and grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. Since taking office, the president has put forth proposals to Congress that would lower health care, child care, energy costs, and other costs for families, reduce the deficit, and expand our economy's productive capacity. The budget reflects his commitment to working with Congress to pass legislation that achieves those goals. This budget advances a bipartisan unity agenda, including proposals to combat the opioid epidemic, tackle the mental health crisis, support our veterans, and accelerate progress against cancer. It builds on the bipartisan funding bill Congress passed earlier this month and makes key investments in the American people. from expanding economic capacity and improving our public health infrastructure to combating the climate crisis and advancing equity, dignity, and security for all Americans. And during what will be a decisive decade for the world, the budget strengthens our military and leverages America's renewed strength at home, so our nation is prepared to meet pressing global challenges and manage crises as they arise. With robust investments in our diplomatic and development agencies, the national security budget as a whole will deepen partnerships and alliances and position the United States to compete with China and any other nation from a position of strength. As we've seen over the past month, our renewed partnerships and alliances have been vital to countering Russian aggression in Europe. And I'd like to thank Congress for the supplemental funding to support Ukraine and our regional partners. The budget makes these investments in a fiscally responsible way, reducing deficits by more than $1 trillion and improving our country's long-term outlook. That's because the budget's investments are more than fully paid for through tax reforms that corporations and the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share. That includes a new proposal requiring the richest Americans, billionaires and those worth more than $100 million, to pay a tax rate of at least 20% on all their income, including investment income that currently goes untaxed. The budget also fulfills the president's promise that no one earning less than $400,000 will see a penny of new taxes. And it will reduce the deficits to less than half of last year's levels as a share of economy, while keeping the economic burden of debt low. Overall, the budget puts forward an economically and fiscally responsible path forward, addressing our country's long-term fiscal challenges while making smart investments that will produce stronger growth and broadly share prosperity for generations to come. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Director Young, for your opening remarks. We will now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them electronically to the email inbox we have established within 7 days of the hearing. I defer my questioning to the end, so I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our director, Shalonda Young. We're very proud of the work you're doing, very impressed by your presentation here. Those of us who worked with you on the Appropriations Committee have a special pride and satisfaction in the job you're doing, so congratulations. We're glad to see you, and we're also glad to see the President's budget. As the chairman of the Transportation HUD Subcommittee, we will look forward to early hearings with Secretaries Fudge and Buttigieg, and we will, of course, as usual, look at every line of this budget proposal with care. We like what we see so far, though, I must say. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has a 9.5% increase, much needed. We can use it very wisely, I think, to address homelessness and housing costs, to expand and improve the housing stock. And we intend, as you do, to focus throughout on safety, on equity, on climate resiliency, and energy efficiency. The transportation side of the budget also looks good. That's a 2% increase. It's building in good ways on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, with a particular emphasis on transit and passenger rail. And so we look forward to scrutinizing this budget and moving forward to put it before the House at an early point. This morning, I want to concentrate on another hat I wear and a program that I've been concerned about for my entire career and that I think is very important for us to focus on at this juncture, and that is national service, AmeriCorps, Senior AmeriCorps and regular AmeriCorps. The budget has a $1.34 billion item for AmeriCorps. That is an increase over $1.15 billion in the current year. It also follows a historic $1 billion investment in the American Rescue Plan, which, as you know, helped AmeriCorps respond to the pandemic, diversify its workforce. There was a lot that we were able to achieve there with that additional funding. We increased AmeriCorps' diversity. in its equity efforts. We increased the living allowances of members, and we enabled some redeployment to go on with respect to pandemic needs. Now, what is the administration's plan going forward? That is my question. We of course want to sustain these roles that have been taken on during the pandemic. Is this money sufficient to do that, to sustain the increases that we've had during the pandemic period? And what is your vision for national service moving forward? The other element in this, of course, is the proposed Civilian Climate Corps, which has yet to be enacted by us. It was enacted by the House, has yet to be enacted by the full Congress. But I'm interested in what you envision here, what role the Civilian Climate Corps plays in the budget, and what kind of potential this has to not just augment AmeriCorps, but give it a stronger focus on conservation and on community resilience. So what's the future of AmeriCorps in the administration's view, and how is it reflected in this budget?
Mr. Price, I'd like to call you Chairman Price. He was my first chairman I worked for on the Appropriations Committee. One, I want to thank you for your work on AmeriCorps, also National HDP, the House Democracy Partnership. Mr. Price likes to focus his attention on programs that bring out the best value of Americans, and I want to thank you for your focus. I did a service project with the new head of AmeriCorps on Martin Luther King Day. I want you to know our commitment to AmeriCorps is strong, and I think one of the things budgets of past administrations would do, it would look at past legislation that was passed, like the $1 billion in ARP, and reduce the budgeted amount, ensure retraction. We're not doing that. We're building on top of the rescue plan funding that was provided. As you mentioned, we're providing $1.3 billion here, $189 million increase compared to the enacted level. So an expansion, it would allow AmeriCorps to increase the member living allowances and volunteer stipends. It would also support increases in higher education awards for AmeriCorps volunteers that aligns with the President's Pell Grant increases. The budget also includes $20 million to add staffing at AmeriCorps to implement the Civilian Climate Corps that you mentioned, and that would be in partnership with the Department of Labor and Department of Interior and USDA.
Thank you. I do think the Civilian Climate Corps is a powerful idea, and I'm glad you're assuming that it is fully enacted and that you will have these costs accounted for budget. And I also think that as we deliberate on this budget, and this bridges 2 or 3 subcommittees, we do need to pay attention not just to the full strength of AmeriCorps, but also how it's organized, and particularly how this Climate Corps is fully integrated into AmeriCorps operations. So thank you for that, and we'll look forward to working with you on that.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 10 minutes to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, inflation is at a 40-year high, 7.9% in the year-to-year report from February. Fed Chairman Powell has now said that when it comes to the inflation crisis transitory, which the administration has done repeatedly, he says, quote, "I think it's probably a good time to retire that word," close quote. I could not agree more. Have you spoken with the president about what can be done to solve the inflation crisis?
Ranking Member Smith, we absolutely talk about inflation along with economic growth, wage growth. We have to make sure that as we grow the economy, as you heard I talked about, we grew the economy the largest rate in 40 years. We also have to take into account with that came higher levels of inflation.
So it's very concerning. I'm glad that you have spoken to the president about inflation. What's concerning is this budget proposal projects starting today that inflation will be at 2% for the next 10 years. Because the first year you say 4.7%, but already for the year it's over 8%. So it would have to be 2% every month for the rest of the year to meet those averages, plus 2% for the next 9 years. Completely unrealistic when we're probably going to hit double digits inflation. So to hit the inflation projections in this budget, it's madness. What policies in this budget brings it down where inflation will be at 2%?
Mr. Smith, I'm happy to walk you through how we do calculations for the budget, these numbers were locked in early November. At the time, we were in line with blue chip private forecasters, but inflation is clearly at a
So
different level.
Director, 5 months ago, you locked in these inflation numbers. So you did 4.7% 5 months ago, and 2 weeks ago, it came out at 7.9%. You guys were off by almost double in that 5-month span. I just want to know, what policies do you all have in this proposal? Because spending $73 trillion just seems like it's only going to fuel the inflation fire. So I'd like to know how you're going to help the people of Southern Missouri to be able to afford food on their table, clothes on their backs, and gasoline in their cars.
Yeah, I'm sure you have paid close attention to the president's plan on dealing with competition in the private sector and also improving supply chain challenges, which are global in nature. I'd also point out that inflation is a global trend. Almost every developed country is seeing inflationary growth. What that tells us is that we have a global issue. It's not one bill, one country's specific policies. This is something all major countries are facing coming out of the pandemic.
So I would be curious, does the president believe spending $73 trillion over the next 10 years will reduce inflation or increase inflation?
The president believes the fiscally responsible thing to do is to pay for our proposals. That is why you see this budget bring down deficits over the 10-year period by over $1 trillion.
Wow, Director. This proposal over the next 10 years actually increases the national debt by $16 trillion, which is going to have more than $1 trillion deficit every year for the next 10 years, which is the highest sustained amount of deficits in the history of our nation. And you're saying that this proposal is bringing down the deficits?
Ranking member, I know we all know that deficits and debt are two different things. We bring down the deficit by $1 trillion. The debt rises, as many of you know, because of entitlements. What this president is not going to do is put forth proposals to cut benefits for our seniors in this country.
You know, I think that we all care about our seniors, Social Security and Medicare. That's why this proposal, Director, is very alarming to me, that by the year 2032, thanks to the $73 trillion worth of spending and the more than $1 trillion deficits every year by the proposal of this budget, that we are going to be at $45 trillion of our national debt. But just paying interest on that national debt is going to cost us $1.1 trillion just on interest, which means that will now be the third largest program that we have to pay for in our entire government, behind Medicare and Social Security. So this reckless spending is actually devastating our seniors, because now it's competing with them as being one of the most costly programs. Let's go on to the tax increases. Analysis of the tax increases in the president's budget shows they will lead to fewer jobs in the country and a reduction in wages. What is the president's rationale for imposing tax increases that will harm jobs, particularly when the country is trying to emerge from a pandemic?
I'd be interested in seeing your analysis. The president has been very clear. He will not subscribe to trickle-down economics. He believes that we should invest in the middle class, those working to get to the middle class, and he has a policy, and this budget follows it, not to raise taxes for anyone making less than $400,000.
In this proposal, you allow expiration of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, correct?
Yes.
And so by expiration of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, that is going to raise taxes on every average day American by $2,000 a year. And those are people making less than $100,000 a year. So in fact, this budget does that. It also increases taxes on gasoline and fossil fuels by $45 billion over the next 10 years. And like I said, the people of Southern Missouri, they're struggling to put gas in their car when gasoline has gone up 79% since Joe Biden took the oath of office here. And what is his solution in this budget? To only increase taxes more on their gasoline, driving up the $4.50 a gallon per gas to $5, $6. How do you respond to that?
Easily. I think it was a bipartisan interest here to ensure that we countered Russian aggression as strongly as possible. And the president reminded the American people with that would come possibly higher gas prices, and that has happened. He has been very clear with the American people that a strong response could possibly cause this to happen. Since Russian aggression, gas has gone up about $1. It is unfortunate that Russia has chosen to bring the global economy down this path, but it was appropriate for all developing countries to stand together and push back on this tyrant and his actions.
Director, I appreciate your comments, and you're doing a great job for the president, but let's get the facts out to the American people. On his first week in office, President Biden did executive orders to eliminate the Keystone XL pipeline that allowed us to purchase energy from our neighbors in Canada, also freezing new oil and drilling on federal lands. And let's put it this way. On April 24th, 2020, at a Casey's in Southeast Missouri, you could buy gasoline at 97 cents a gallon. That was under a Trump presidency. You can't find gas at 97 cents a gallon. In 2020, we were energy independent. We were exporting energy in this country. But under the direct policies of President Biden and the Democrat-controlled Congress, they reversed those policies to make us energy dependent on Russia, on Venezuela, on people who love to burn our flag. And it's so unfortunate this budget proposal only wants to tax the energy industry more to make it harder on everyday Americans. And the Americans are going to see it. I am interested. There was $1.9 billion that was in this most recent omnibus bill that's been carried over to finish the border wall. Is this administration going to finish the border wall?
Just so we're clear, the $1.9 billion wasn't rescinded. New money was not provided. The administration had a policy asking Congress to rescind that funding from 2021. Congress did not. But Congress did not provide additional money. And we are spending, as GAO has told this committee and others, that OMB, the president, the administration is acting within the bounds of the Empowerment and Control Act, and we are spending, obligating prudently.
So this administration just continues to withhold the $1.9 billion that was appropriated several Congresses ago that has stayed in the account.
Thankfully, GAO has agreed that we are obligating prudently under the law.
And what are you obligating it to? Because you're not doing any construction. So are you just paying people to hold the rusting materials?
No, we're actually doing environmental restoration, something that was woefully lacking. We're also doing community consultation. I think that's important to many of you who represent constituents.
I have 25 seconds, Director. I would like to know, how did this administration transfer almost $2 billion of COVID money to house illegals at the southern border when it was supposed to go towards replacing the national stockpile and for COVID tests?
It was supposed to go for COVID, and it went to COVID issues at the southern border. COVID for COVID.
So housing illegals was issues for COVID?
We had to test people immigrating into this country, and we also had to socially distance children who could not be close to each other due to COVID.
Would love that documentation, Director, along
Here's
with
a binder
answers.
we have provided to Congress full of COVID information,
And answers to our 40 letters that are hanging out there to the
including,
administration.
before Budget Day, asking what was in the budget. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it is wonderful, Director Young. Now I can say Director Young, and I would always forget to add the acting anyway. So I'm glad it is now official. And thank you for the wonderful job you do serving the American people. I wanted to use this as an opportunity just to focus on the major facts. Both you and Chairman Yarmouth talked about this before, but I think that a lot of times in these hearings, the most important facts can sometimes be obscured by all the rhetoric that we hear. So can you remind us again, this past year, it was the fastest economic growth in America in how many years?
40.
And how many new jobs were created?
Over 6 million, the most in recorded history.
The most in American history. And by what amount is the deficit projected to fall?
$1.3 trillion, the largest decline year over year.
Greatest economic growth in American history, jobs added, largest deficit reduction. I don't remember many economists credibly predicting that this time a year ago. It is certainly a record to be very proud of, those in the administration, and frankly, those of us who fought for and voted for the American Rescue Plan. Now, I want to shift to the topic of raising taxes, because we have two very interesting proposals that are out there. There is the one new proposal from this administration that just came out, the billionaire minimum tax. I happen to be the lead co-author of the House version, or one version, of what essentially is attempting to achieve the same thing, ensure that billionaires who are avoiding paying low tax or avoiding paying either their fair share or any taxes at all, make sure that they begin paying. But then there's this other interesting proposal from the Republicans. The Senate Republican leader of their Senate campaign committee has a proposal that, as he was confirming yesterday on Fox News, would raise taxes on more than 50 million Americans. In fact, more than half of those who are under the poverty line would pay higher taxes. Even further, his proposal and their proposal would sunset Social Security and Medicare after 5 years. And again, this is not just an accusation. To his credit, he has openly admitted it, and Fox News has confirmed it. So could you describe why the administration believes it is more fair to go after billionaires who are currently paying lower taxes than middle-class people in my district in Philadelphia, as opposed to going after the poor and the working class?
Look, the budgets are value statements. The president has been clear about that. What he believes is fair is to ask billionaires and those worth over $100 million to pay about the same tax rates as teachers, nurses, and firefighters. That's all he's asking. They're supposed to pay taxes on this unrealized income. They often use loopholes, deferments, not to do that. So this president's been very clear. What we're not going to do is send forward a budget that cuts benefits to our seniors, but he will ask those worth more. The 400 wealthiest people in this country are worth more than 150 million other Americans. He does not believe that's right, and he is calling on them to pay their fair share.
And am I correct that the average effective rate among those 400 that you mentioned is currently 8%?
Research tells us it's about 8%.
Yeah, I certainly know that the firefighters and teachers who live in my neighborhood in Northeast Philadelphia, they would love to pay an 18%, or excuse me, an 8% tax rate. They pay far higher than 8 or 18%. And just to be clear, this administration is not supportive of the Senate Republican Campaign Committee chief's plan to raise taxes on more than 50% of the American people and sunset Social Security and Medicare, correct?
Not to comment on the individual proposal, but this president will not, has not, will not be submitting a budget that cuts benefits for our seniors.
Well, thank you, and I join with the administration certainly in that, and I thank you for your time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Director, for being here. I just want to say, I think the budget does show the values, and there's a 525% increase in the EPA, while there is a decrease in defense spending. There is taxes that go higher for 700 billionaires, but for $700 billion tax cut for millionaires. I don't know. I mean, from where I'm from, millionaires are rich people too. So we're doing a tax cut to millionaires while increasing on billionaires. I hear all this about how great the economy is going and how many jobs, the unemployment rate is the lowest and how many jobs are created. But here's what my people see in Mississippi. They go to a restaurant at lunch, which is closed because there's not enough workers to open that restaurant. There's not enough workers to do the job. So if there's truly job increases and more people working, then why don't we have employees in restaurants and places where people go to eat? The other thing I see is inflation. You talk about no tax on people under $400,000. Well, I agree with Ranking Member Smith that, first of all, the $2,000 in taxes that goes away with the tax cut, that is a tax increase. It's $2,000 every American, regardless of income, will pay next year. The other is $3,500 annually in inflation. Last year, $3,500 more. What my people see, they don't see a better world today than they did last year. They see worse. When they go to the gas pump, when it costs $40, I'll talk, because I have to actually fill up my car. Instead of filling up and it costing $30 or $40, now it costs $70 or $80 to fill up. And trying to blame Putin for the gas raising prices is just not, it's disingenuous. Prices were high before he invaded Ukraine. Here's what I will tell you. In last year's budget, 3 considerations were given the most thing. And number 3 of those, this is from the president and from the budget last year, not funding work that directly subsidizes fossil fuels, including work that lowers the cost of production, lowers the cost of consumption. That means prices at the pump, cost of consumption is what you pay for gas, or raises the revenues retained by producers of fossil fuels. When you intentionally raise gas prices, you intentionally raise gas prices. And after you do that, you don't get to blame it on something that happened after the fact. I want to talk just a little bit about defense. This budget proposes that we raise our defense a little bit. But we went through this same thing, but a lot of that goes to climate, to other things. What we need to do is make sure we keep above. The House and the Senate Armed Services Committees both sent to you that we needed a 5% increase over inflation. Can you truthfully tell me at the current inflation rate that the number given to defense is a 5% increase over the rate of inflation this year?
I will tell you, our number is 9.8% over the 2021 levels. We believe we sent up a budget that is strategy-based, and we're not going to pick a budget out of thin air for political purposes. The Secretary stands behind this number, and we believe when you see the National Defense Strategy, hopefully this week, that this budget is aligned with strategy.
I agree that it does not. It does not meet the 5% increase over inflation, which means China and Russia continue, and this is a dangerous time, and we need to continue to raise that. I go back to budgets show the president's value. He's creating 87,000 new IRS employees to target folks making less than $400,000 to see where they spend every one of their dollars through monitoring their bank records, so we can make sure we get every single dime out of those making less than $400,000 than we do. He is decreasing taxes on millionaires while raising it on billionaires, but I would argue he's also raising it on those people. And if you talk to the normal person, they truly do not believe that the economy is better off right now because their groceries go up, their milk costs more per gallon, their meat costs more, they are having to substitute things that they would rather not eat, they can't afford to fill up their cars now, they put in $10, which barely gets them any gas, and the gas prices will continue to go up as long as we continue to try to cause them to go up. And going back to the president's words last year, he intended to make the cost of consumption of fossil fuels go up in his last year's budget, and I would say he succeeded in that. I hope he doesn't succeed in raising taxes on the IRS, invading our homes, and in continuing to not support the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, I just want to address the issue of energy independence. You know, the United States in the previous 4 years of the past administration was importing about 22 million barrels of Russian crude oil every single month and other petroleum products. And if we're really serious about energy independence, the Build Back Better program should be advanced so that we can make a transition, a real transition to electric vehicles. Today, in the world, there are 211 battery manufacturing plants. 156 of them are in China. 12 of them are in the United States. And we are engaged in a military activity, in Eastern Europe right now, primarily because of oil and natural gas. 65% of all the natural gas that goes into Germany comes from Russia. 40% of all the natural gas that goes to each of the European Union countries comes from Russia. If that is not an urgent reminder of the need to become energy independent, the last 20 years in 3 Middle East wars and spending $6 trillion is. With respect to this budget, the American economy today is about $25 trillion. The billionaire's minimum tax, I presume, is a response to this whole concept of buy, borrow, and die. In other words, very wealthy people buy an asset, they build an asset, they borrow against the asset, and they never sell the asset, and therefore they don't pay taxes on it. Jeff Bezos from Amazon, for example, is worth $200 billion. He pays himself a salary of about $81,000 a year and pays very little taxes. So I presume that the billionaire's minimum tax is intended to address that, recognizing the fact that it's perfectly legal, but I presume that that's the purpose?
Yeah, I remind people, when regular people need a loan, you use your income to show the bank what you can borrow and pay back. The income, the investment income that we're taxing here, often, as you pointed out, is never paid. Taxes are never paid on it, they're deferred. But they also get a lot of benefits from carrying that investment income, including getting to use that as leverage for loans. It is treated like income for many actions that regular people only have work income to do with, including making extraordinary loans against their investment income. So we believe we have to find a way to deal with this disparity of people who go to work every day. They're paying a higher tax rate on their work income. We have to find an equivalent way to deal with those who pay no income on taxes. They are supposed to at some point, but often defer.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, Jeff Bezos in 2011 was only worth $18 billion, and he qualified for the child tax credit. The previous administration had average economic growth each year of 2.5%. This is pre-pandemic, and then the economy went deeply into recession for a short period of time. Last year, the first year of the Biden administration, economic growth was 5.7%, and it's projected to be 3.6% for 2022. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
Okay. And you also, have a situation where in the Build Back Better program, although that's not part of this budget, it's really an investment in American families, because every single day, 10,000 kids are born in America. Every single day, 10,000 people in America turn 65, and we really don't have an American family policy. And the intent is really just to make our own people that much more economically independent, self-sufficient, and productive through adulthood. And all these concerns that I've heard in published reports about inflation, yes, that's a concern. We've had 24 months of a highly distorted economy. It is going to take time to recover, and we are, in fact, recovering. But the American economy will produce $300 trillion in stuff in the next 10 years. That's goods and services. Spending, investing, less than 1% of that in American families and the productivity of the American economy is not inflationary. In fact, it's an investment in future growth that can be, inflation can be handled. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Mcclintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to get some fundamental facts straight here, and let's begin with three numbers: 27, 58, and 89. 27% is the growth in population and inflation combined over this past decade, 27%. 58% is the growth in federal tax revenues in the same period, 58%. That's more than double inflation and population growth. That, by the way, that's after the Trump tax cuts produced one of the most prosperous periods for working Americans in our history. 89% is the increase in federal spending. It's the spending stupid. We have before us a budget that dramatically raises taxes and claims that we're going to reduce the deficit. But taxes and deficits are the same thing. They are the only two ways to pay for spending. You either take it out of a family's current earnings or you take it out of their future earnings by borrowing it. A deficit, a future tax, is paid for in two ways. We either borrow it from capital markets that then reduces the amount that's available to make consumer loans and have to be paid back through future taxes, or we simply print that money, which produces inflation. That's largely how this administration's financed its multi-million-dollar spending scheme. The result's nearly 8% annual inflation, costing an average family $3,500 in lost purchasing power. What it also means is if a family's put $100,000 toward their retirement, they've just seen $7,900 taken from them. It turns out all that free money that you folks sent out is very expensive, and Americans are paying it back at the gas station and the grocery store every day. Now, this budget repeals the Trump tax cuts. Now remember, we took in more revenues after the tax cuts. So great was the economic expansion that they produced. And they weren't tax cuts for the rich. The wealthiest 1% saw their share of income taxes actually grow. The average household saved between $1,000 and $2,000. The Democrats would repeal these tax cuts. The corporate tax goes to 28%, higher than communist China. But corporations don't pay corporate taxes. People do. They can only be paid in one of three ways: by consumers through higher prices, by employees through lower wages, or by investors through lower earnings. That's your 401k. Now, they say they'll make the wealthy pay their fair share. According to the Tax Foundation, the wealthiest 1% earn 20% of all income and yet pay 39% of all income taxes. That's double their fair share. But put that aside for a second. You are proposing to tax capital gains. What is an unrealized capital gain? It's the paper increase in assets that you haven't cashed in on. It's a tax on money that you haven't received. But don't worry, they say, that's just on those worth $100 billion or more. But once they've introduced this concept into law, how long will it take them to come after your pension funds earnings before you've received them? You know, this whole mess isn't the fault of taxpayers for not paying enough taxes. It's the spending that is robbing families of their disposable income, their savings, and their future economic growth. And I think it's disingenuous to compare this budget to last year and saying, well, the deficit's down and growth's up. Deficits are down only compared to the most irresponsible spending spree in American history that's produced the worst inflation rate in 40 years. Growth is up only compared to the lockdown left's draconian COVID policies that took a wrecking ball to our economy and utterly failed to slow the spread of the pandemic. Americans are now getting a taste of what socialism consistently produces. There are 2.1 million fewer Americans working today than before the lockdowns. American family purchasing power has declined since this administration took office. Inflation's at its highest rate in 40 years. Gas prices were up 40% before Putin invaded Ukraine. You know, the American people need to connect the dots between budgets like this and the conditions that they're now suffering before it's too late. I've got just one question. This administration's admitted more than 1 million impoverished illegal immigrants into the interior so far, in addition to 500,000 gotaways. That's roughly the combined population of Montana and Wyoming just since you took office. I'm wondering, how much is this costing local, state, and federal taxpayers?
One, thank you for the diatribe. I certainly.
I beg your pardon?
Which piece of of what you put forward can I respond to. You put a lot out there that we have disagreements with the way it's framed. We have 700
It's your
people.
policies that have caused these conditions.
We have
What's there to
700
disagree
people
about?
who are
That's reality.
billionaires or hundreds of millionaires that we're talking about, not regular Americans.
How much of
This
the 1.5
president will
million
not raise
illegal
taxes
immigrants that you
on
have admitted
anyone
into the
making less
country
than $400,000.
costing taxpayers? That is the question.
His time has expired. If you'll let the witness respond, then we can move on. But you can't continue to debate her and when your time's expired.
I asked her a simple question. I'd like a simple answer. How much is this costing?
I look forward to the support you have for the 5% increase at DHS that will allow us to manage the
So it's in
southern
your
border.
don't know, don't care file. I get it. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership, for convening us here today. Director Young, it's always wonderful to see you. Thank you for the extraordinary job that you and the Biden administration are doing relative to the economy. Look forward to discussing some of those more accurate numbers momentarily. I see my good friend Alveo Series. I want to just acknowledge his presence, congratulate him on the great run that the St. Peter's Peacocks had. Of course, Alveo is a former varsity basketball player for St. Peter's. He set this all in motion. Alveo, it's good to see you, and what a great run. I know you are proud as a Peacock. Shalonda, Director Young, there were several numbers that were thrown out, but I want to talk about just a few more accurate ones. 3.8%, that's the unemployment rate. But when President Biden first took office, just a little over a year ago, that unemployment rate was about 6.4%. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And did it come down in record time?
Let me point out that all of this was not by accident. None of the numbers we've talked about, the fastest decline in history, the employment rate, would have been possible without this president's management of the pandemic.
That's correct. Beginning with the American Rescue Plan, which not a single one of my Republican colleagues voted for in either the House or the Senate. That was the foundation for turning the economy around. And the economic growth comparison doesn't relate to what happened when the country shut down under the previous president. Am I correct that what we've seen under the Biden administration, the Biden economy, is the fastest rate of economic growth in 40 years?
It is, absolutely, year over year.
Now, with respect to fiscal responsibility, my colleagues talk a lot about that, and they talk about socialism. You know what socialism is? That's the GOP tax scam. 83% of the benefits going to the wealthiest 1%. That is socialism for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected for no reason other than to subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and shameless. I'm proud of the economy and the budget that you have put forward, which is designed to invest in everyday Americans. In fact, wages are up right now, but we do have to continue to work to lower costs. Could you speak a little bit about that effort in the context of this budget?
Absolutely. One, I spoke about global supply chain challenges. We need to get stuff off of ships and onto shelves. And this budget provides investments in our port infrastructure. I also want to thank the Congress for the infrastructure bill. A second round of Army Corps funding was just announced that dredged important ports around the country to ensure that we can move these goods to shelves so the American people can continue to buy things. And we believe that is a key part of fighting inflation. We also believe we have to ensure that corporations, companies have competition in their system and the way we operate. So we absolutely know we have to work on this, but one thing we need to do is a balanced approach. We've seen wage growth. We need to make sure as we tackle inflation, we can keep these gains in wage growth and also economic growth. So there is a balancing act here.
And with respect to some of the revenue proposals, I think most everyday Americans would have no issue with increasing the taxes that the 25 richest billionaires in America pay, because currently they pay little to no taxes. That's less tax often than firefighters, police officers, nurses, social workers, transportation workers, healthcare aides, and our healthcare heroes who have helped us get through this pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about the resources that are being raised just in the context of what it will allow us to invest in as the Biden administration invests in everyday Americans?
So tax reform has two benefits. One, it is a fairness issue. Should the richest American 700 people pay less than half of regular folks who you represent? The other benefit of tax reform is we get to invest in the regular Americans who have price pressures that we've talked a lot about here today. Should we have legislation that reduces the cost of childcare, for example? Families shouldn't pay more than we think, shouldn't pay more than 7% of their income on childcare costs. We believe that we should have efforts to negotiate prescription drugs prices through Medicare so that families can afford life-saving treatments. So we have a difference of agreement. We all want to help these families, but we think the way to do that is through proposals that invest in the American people to help with those pocketbook issues that both sides of the aisle have brought up many times today.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
And I thank the chair, and thanks to our witness for being here today. You know, we've not had a hearing with the Congressional Budget Office. The baseline CBO report has not come out, and when you ask the reason why, at least what they told me was because OMB hadn't produced their numbers yet. So now perhaps, Mr. Chairman, that OMB has produced the president's budget, we will get to hear from the Congressional Budget Office. But in that interim, in that meantime, the director of the CBO did visit with some of us individually, and I'm grateful that he did that. So let me just ask a couple of things that were assertions that were made to me by the director of the CBO, and I'll ask you to attest to their veracity or not. One of the things the CBO director said was that we vastly underestimated how strong the economy was going into the pandemic. And thank God that it was, to be able to withstand the ravages of the pandemic. But would you agree with that statement, that the economy was significantly stronger than anticipated going into the recession?
I'd say we did enter a recessionary period during the pandemic. We believe we were able to recover from that, not from the economy that was there before the pandemic, but because of the work, in many cases, bipartisan work. This Congress, on a bipartisan basis, passed COVID legislation to help the former administration respond to the pandemic. And ARP, we believe, did finalize the job.
The fact is, we were on our way out of the recession when we threw gas on the inflationary fire with some of the other reconciliation bills that passed the last calendar year. Mr. Swagel also asserted that the collections, the federal income tax collections, and I guess we're working, current law is the 2017 tax law, correct? And that collections have been at all-time highs. In fact, they didn't diminish during the pandemic. They've been sustained. Was that an accurate statement that he made to me?
Yes.
So even under what people are describing as a dreadful and unfair taxing system, it is producing historic levels of revenue, more so than the pre-2017 tax law that had been in place for 31 years, greater than that produced. Is that correct?
We think the wealthiest did quite well during the pandemic.
As well, you know, wasn't the question. Well, let me ask you this. Mr. Mcclintock asked it, and then it didn't get answered, but taxing unrealized gains, okay, that's going to be a little tough, but I'm sure someone will be able to figure it out. But what happens to those equities that are held in retirement, as retirement securities? Are those unrealized gains in that fund going to be taxed as well?
No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about unrealized gains from stocks for the 700 people who are worth more than $100 million.
Will they be able to deduct? You know, I've also been a holder of some investments when the economy went the other way. And the statement during the 1980s was, well, you haven't lost it till you sold it. Will they be able to deduct losses from their taxes if the market goes down?
For those 700 people, we are phasing in over 5 years for exactly the reason you talk about. We don't want to get into a situation where 1 year your stock may be worth $100 and you pay, and then you come and ask for a refund when it's worth $80 the next year. So this is a phased-in approach for things you own before this would go into.
Yeah, good
So
luck. It sounds
in 5
absolutely
years.
unworkable. Let me just ask you this. I see where the commitment is made to provide. The total was $4 billion. It's now nearly $1 billion this year that's going to the governments of Central America. And this, I assume, is on top of the foreign aid that was already going to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Is that correct?
We
This is
do
in
have
addition?
yes, we do have a request in to deal with the Northern Triangle.
And methods of accountability. I mean, if those governments really cared about the people that they were supposed to care about, I don't think we'd have as many at our southern border. Are there built-in accountability methods as the previous administration had done?
The previous administration, as you point out, did not send funding down. We also have the option, the way appropriations usually writes the law, to withhold if we aren't getting the results we need to see. But we do believe we have to deal with the root causes of migration, and this funding would allow us to do that.
Well, I submit you're pouring gasoline on fires that exist. Mr. Chairman, let me just ask you this. Are we ever going to vote on a budget this year?
It's a good question.
And if we vote on a budget, will the president's budget be introduced and give everyone a chance to vote on the
That
president's?
decision hasn't been made.
Your time is.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, welcome and congratulations to you. It's wonderful to see you here. You know, I'm so happy that you mentioned, I think a couple of times, that the president believes in building an economy from the middle out and the bottom up. It's so refreshing to me. And despite the robust support for the wealthiest Americans and the biggest corporations that I hear from the other side of the aisle, in fact, most Americans understand that the rich have been getting richer and the poor have been getting poorer, not by accident, but by policy, tax policy, et cetera, that we have had, and that the president is committed now not to punish the wealthy, but to say they need to pay their fair share. And there's a big cheer out in a bipartisan way in this country for that kind of idea. For the last 10 years, we've really had an austerity budget, particularly because of sequestration. And it's really, I think, hurt so much of our economy. And one agency I wanted to talk to you about that has been the victim of sequestration has been the National Labor Relations Board, which has remained pretty much flat funded since 2014. In order for it to really, for the NLRB to really do its job, it needs to have increased funding. We have seen a 50% increase in union election petitions, but the total of the funding has fallen by 30% since the year 2010. Now, I know that the budget that that the president has presented has actually increased the NLRB funding by 16%. But I wanted to ask you if you really feel that the kind of funding that we're going to be able to see is going to help protect and empower American workers. And let me just add the second part. Would the administration raise any concerns if the Congress were to provide additional funding increase to the NLRB?
None at all. And as you point out, the agency has really been starved of resources and has lost significant staff capacity over the years. This budget, I would say, begins the rebuild with a $45 million requested increase. But certainly if Congress wants to start that rebuild faster, we'd be supportive.
Let me ask you another question. One of the constituent service issues that I get all the time is that people, ordinary people who are trying to get information about their 2020 taxes has been a real problem. And I am just wondering if we're going to be able to bolster the number of employees at the IRS that are going to be able to address this problem.
So as you've heard, we have an increase in the budget for IRS. We believe Americans should not have to wait for hours on hold to get information about their tax situation. If there's one mistake on your form, you often have to, some of the worst stories, wait months to get refunds due to you. So we believe that this increase is the right thing to do for the American citizens who are required to pay taxes and should have the service that goes along with that requirement.
Thank you. And it seems to me, too, that if we're looking at making the most efficient work of the IRS, that we also begin to look, again, at the wealthiest Americans, who we are, it's kind of like, where do you go? You go where the money is. And I'm just wondering if we can refocus on making sure that the very wealthiest are paying something, because we have seen paying nothing too often from the wealthiest Americans. Can we make sure that we're not just focusing on everyday working people, but also on the people who are making the most money?
So I'm certainly not going to suggest that we tell the IRS who to look at, but I will point out not just the wealthiest corporations, 50 corporations on the Fortune 500 list paid no taxes in 2020. We think that's not right. So certainly this budget recognizes the inequity that you pointed out, and we do need resources in the IRS, mostly to ensure that our citizens can get the services they deserve.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, thank you for being here. I appreciate your attendance very much. And I want to ask you, Director Young, the president said, and I quote, "Budgets are statements of values, and the budget I am releasing today sends a clear message that we value fiscal responsibility, safety, and security at home and around the world." End quote. Let me begin by saying that I applaud these newfound priorities that include advertised increases for defense at 4%. However, as we all know, inflation's at 8%. So if we're increasing defense by 4%, we're actually looking at a cut here. So even though inflation ends up it being a cut, and we also see a cut for funding the police. Let me ask you, Director Young, last year, was the administration aware that Russia was occupying Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine?
I'm happy to talk about the budget elements, but that is
And that's
certainly a policy.
that's what I'm getting at.
Okay, I would leave that to the policy experts in the administration.
But
that is
you
not
would
mine.
agree that they were aware of this, even though they proposed a cut in defense?
That is a policy best
Understood.
directed to the Department of Defense or the National Security Council. I'm
Understood.
happy to answer anything about the budget.
I got you, and that's why I'm asking this, because this is about the budget. Did the administration consider Russia an adversary or a threat to national security of the United States at the time when it only increased defense by 1.6%? And that is a budget question, because when you formulate a budget, as the president said, it represents your values. So what I'm trying to get at here and what I'm trying to understand is what the administration considered when they proposed to cut in defense.
Do we consider the 4% increase this year a cut?
We do because inflation is at 8%.
We don't see the defense budget as a cut. The Secretary of Defense will, I'm sure many of you will hear from him when he comes to Congress. He will tell you he stands behind this number, and we believe is strategy-based.
What about crime in our cities as well? Because again, if it represents the values, then the values have to go along with knowing what's going on in our country, knowing what's going on in our world. If we're talking about a budget that reflects the values of the administration and the values of this country, what about the cuts that went to state and local governments from the Justice Department of $2 billion?
There are no cuts in the budget to cops. We're asking for a $300 million increase in community-oriented policing, $3.2 billion for all state and local grants at DOJ.
But there are to the Justice Department, there are cuts of $2 billion.
The grants to state and locals to deal with violence is increased in this budget. In addition, there's a mandatory proposal we hope that many of you will support, $30 billion to deal with crime in our loved communities.
Let me ask you something, and obviously I'm trying to get a point across here that we're making cuts to a budget, to defense, to crime, where we should be making increases and where we should be reflecting our values. As the president says, this budget is supposed to reflect the values of this administration, of this country, and of this executive branch. So that's what I'm trying to get about, to get the point out here. And from last year, I asked this question last year. Does the administration not think that these are credible threats when talking about defense spending, that we should be conceding our world leadership role? And yet, here we are a year later, and we're still making essentially cuts to defense and not addressing crime like we should be. This budget is too little, too late. It truly embodies the administration's leading from behind strategy. In fact, I'd call it simply reacting. People have already died. People have died because of crime. People have died because of our lack of funding defense. The number of murders in 2021 was 5% higher than counts recorded in 2020. And as we know, Russia has invaded Ukraine. Again, if we already knew these were problems and they were widely reported, why are we just now asking for funding to fix them?
Funding that are increased over last year. I hope we can, agree to simple facts. Department of Defense will receive a 4% increase under this budget. We ask again, Congress did not provide, but this president is asking again for community-oriented policing increase of $300 million. And we're asking for support of our mandatory proposal for $30 billion to deal with violence.
Understood, Ms. Young. But again, I'm trying to get at what the president is referring to as the values that this administration embodies and that this administration embraces. Trying to understand that. Just out of curiosity.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you so much, Chairman Yarmouth, and to the ranking member. Director Young, thank you for being here today to speak with us and for your work to deliver a budget that proves that we can invest in America while also bringing down the deficit and fighting inflation. You should be proud, Director Young. You have risen from staff director from the House Appropriations Committee to now testifying in front of Congress as the Senate-confirmed director for OMB. We couldn't be prouder for you. I want to commend the administration's efforts to finally make the wealthiest in this country pay their fair share in taxes. For too long, the hardworking men and women of this country have been left holding the bag, while billionaires have used their army of tax lawyers to pay virtually nothing in federal taxes. If we want to invest in the American spirit and do so in a financially responsible way, then we need proposals like the 20% minimum tax to at least make sure billionaire CEOs pay a comparable rate to regular, hardworking Americans. I don't understand how my colleagues on the other side would want an average person in their district to pay more than a billionaire. By proposing a deficit-reducing budget, President Biden made sure that we can responsibly invest in our working families, But we must ensure that those investments actually make it to the individuals who need them most. Even though more Americans are taking home a paycheck and families have more money in their pockets, family budgets are still tight. Anyone can see that prices are rising on essential goods across my district and in this country. The pain for working families is real, and it is imperative that this Congress work with the administration to lower costs for everyday Americans. Reducing our deficit, increasing our domestic productivity, and lowering families' biggest cost can fight inflation while also investing in America. In Nevada, and specifically my district, we have seen unconscionable increases in the cost of rental housing, with up to 30% increase in rental cost over the past year. I'm pleased to see that there's $50 billion in this budget for affordable housing construction to grow our supply of housing stock and to stabilize these high price increases. Director Young, as you know, many of the inflationary pressures we feel today are from repeated supply-side shocks. So in your opinion, what are some other meaningful steps the administration could take to provide a budget similar to this one to relieve supply constraints and deliver lower cost to Americans?
So I've talked a little bit about the need to get things off of ships. We've seen extraordinary backlogs at many of our ports, from the West Coast to the South. Not just funding, but we have tried to bring the full weight of the administration to deal with our port challenges, including going so far as to recruit truckers, to get more truckers on the road to move goods. Also assuring that our railways, we can get things moving by rail. We saw during the pandemic, it was a good problem to have at the time. People bought a lot of goods. Our economy turned from service-based, where people spend a lot of money on services, to purchasing a lot of goods. And it fundamentally changed how our economy operated. So we have to keep our foot on the gas to make sure that we can unclog our supply chain issues, because some of those things are going to be with us for a while. We still haven't seen the return to services out of the pandemic that you would expect our economy service to good ratio to be.
Absolutely. With my remaining time, I want to turn to demographic data collection. I'm pleased to see throughout the budget an investment in data collection on STEM participation, climate impacts, and maternal health disparities, but more needs to be done. So Director Young, while there are significant investments in the President's budget towards racial equity in particular, I want to focus on the Justice 40 commitment of $3 billion. What is the administration's plan to make sure these investments are targeted accurately to reduce disparities and direct funding to the hardest hit communities throughout our country?
I'm sure you know about our Executive Order 13985. It requires that we incorporate equity in all we do: racial equity, rural equity, those left behind. Those are our disabled brothers and sisters. Our government should work for all people at all the time. So when we do procurement, we want to make sure that our dollars are spent with socially disadvantaged companies. So we are implementing this executive order not just in the budget, but in how we do business. But you're right, without data, we don't know if we're what kind of job we're doing. So we're absolutely committed to improving our data collection.
And I look forward to working with you in your role as director of OMB so that we can have better data collection and make more informed decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the director for appearing today. Last year, when you testified before this committee, the Consumer Price Index was up 4.2% over the last 12 months, and at that time was the largest 12-month increase since 2008. Almost a year later, thanks to the Biden administration's policies, the annual inflation rate for the U.S. is 7.9% for the 12 months that ended February 2022. And we can blame Russia for gas prices. We can blame the supply chain for inflation rates. We can blame all of the different policies of this administration. But this is the highest inflation rate since January 1982, according to U.S. Labor Department data published March 10th. That translates into a $3,500 annual inflation tax that is being paid by, as you said, normal people in 2021. $296 extra per month going toward the higher cost of inflation due to this administration's policies. 54% higher inflation growth than wage growth. A $12,000 inflation tax to be paid by American families under the Biden budget. The price of meat is up 13%, the price of milk is up 11.2%, the price of electricity is up 9%, the price of baby food is up 8.4%. Gas prices have risen since Joe Biden took office 82%. That's $2,000 in additional costs per family due to the rising cost of gas. So the path we are on is unsustainable. This budget does nothing to address inflation. In fact, the term inflation crisis doesn't show up in this budget once, and it pushes into perpetuity permanent fiscal imbalance. It does nothing to address the permanent imbalance in revenues and expenditures that this federal government is experiencing. So it kicks the can down the road, and the national debt is nearly the size of our economy and will reach a record 107% of GDP by the end of the decade. I want to focus on two things that are going to be happening in this decade: the insolvency of the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund and the insolvency of the Highway Trust Fund, and then the insolvency of the Social Security Old Age and Survivor Insurance Trust Fund by 2033. Why is it that the Biden administration is not sounding the alarm about this looming crisis? And why doesn't this budget, which should be a reflection of the values of this administration, propose to avoid this insolvency in Social Security, Medicare, and Highway Trust Fund that my constituents depend on so much back at home?
Thank you, Mr. Klein. One, I want to assure you the budget assumes, and it's built into the numbers, that those programs, even given the insolvency, that those programs continue at the current rates. So that is built into our figures. We're required to do that by law. So the assumption, all the numbers you have here assume that those programs continue.
But it assumes that they're heading for insolvency in the years that I cited,
It shows that we're spending the same level, that benefits don't stop.
which will result in insolvency in the years that I
Yeah,
cited.
we absolutely need bipartisan solutions. My guess is it's going to take both sides of the aisle here and the administration to come together to find solutions to make sure we deal with the insolvency issues. You absolutely correctly point out.
Your party's in control of the presidency. Your
but
party's in control of Congress. So I would encourage you all to put forward those solutions so that we can work with you.
I appreciate that, but I would like to ensure that, the budget fully assumes that those programs continue.
And assumes that they go off the cliff. I have no further questions. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Before I recognize Ms. Wexton, I want to remind everyone that at 12 o'clock, we are going to take a recess for a half hour, which means we will hear from Ms. Wexton, Mr. Feenstra, Mr. Scott, Mr. Good, and Mr. Sears, and then everybody else will have to come back after 12:30. So with that, I yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Sexton.
Thank you so much, Chairman Yarmouth and Director Young. It's wonderful to see you again. So a lot has changed over the past year, including your confirmation by the Senate. I couldn't be happier that you are now Director Young. Now, reflecting on where we were 1 year ago, I think it's important that we remember, how far we've come. And you've already talked about that some. I mean, we've added more than 6 million jobs, the most ever in a single year. The unemployment rate is now down to pre-pandemic levels. We vaccinated more than 200 million Americans. Now, when President Biden took office, the daily COVID reporting was about 250,000 infections every day, and we're now at a tiny fraction of that. We lowered the child poverty rate to the lowest level ever, and the number of families reporting food insecurity also dropped 32%. Now, that didn't all happen on its own. It happened because we passed the most significant economic legislation ever, the American Rescue Plan, which literally saved the economy. And on top of all that, we passed infrastructure. That's legislation that's finally going to help us fix our aging roads, bridges, and power grids, among other things, also make universal broadband a reality. And we finally ended the joke of Infrastructure Week once and for all. We're even able to do that with some Republican assistance. So thank you to those folks across the aisle who actually voted for that legislation. Not to mention the Competes Act, which is going to conference shortly and will be signed into law, I think, not before too long, which will definitely put the US in a much better place globally for now and into the future. So it's been quite a year. And I just want to thank you for everything that you've done to help us get there. Now, I represent tens of thousands of federal workers in the DC metro region. I know that you're aware of this. And I wanted to thank you for what you did in the budget. First thing I do when I get it is flip to the federal employees section to see where the pay increased. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that it was 4.6%. So thank you so much for that. I, along with a number of people from the metro region, had been advocating for 5.1%, but I think that 4.6 is the biggest increase in many decades. Is that correct?
I've been a federal worker in some form or another for 21 years. I can't remember a increase this large in recent memory.
Thank you so much. And it's a lot better than the freezes and cuts to benefits that were proposed by the previous administration. I also want to talk for a minute about substance abuse treatment. Now, the nation's overdose crisis.
We've lost the audio. Your signal's frozen. You should be back now.
Okay, sorry about that, Mr. Chairman. I tried plugging in and everything. But anyway, so about substance abuse treatment and substance abuse coverage. Can you just explain how the budget addresses mental health and substance use disorder coverage?
Thank you for that. The budget includes $500 million increase over 2022 for state opioid response grants and $1.2 billion over the 22 CR level for the substance abuse prevention and treatment block grant. You heard the president speak to both mental health and opioid as something he hoped to bring the country together. These are bipartisan interests. So we're very proud of putting forth robust requests for both the opioid epidemic to deal with it and also the mental health crisis. And in some ways, those two things are connected, and this budget seeks a holistic way of dealing with both.
Thank you so much. And that's something that affects every congressional district across the country, regardless of whether it's represented by a Republican or a Democrat. So I thank you for doing that. And I was also really happy to see a 19% increase in the funding for the National Science Foundation, especially because they will be doing a lot of research into the opioid addiction treatment and the future of medical treatment for those disorders. So thank you so much for that as well. Very good to see that this critical research will be fully funded. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmuth and Ranking Member Smith. And I want to thank you, Director Young, for testifying today. It's great to see you. And I just want to congratulate you on your confirmation as role of director. Talking with economists, and I taught many economics classes over the years, most economic people would say that it takes approximately 18 months to have something to go into effect, full swing effect when you start talking about taxes, especially when you want to increase taxes or something like that. Would that be a fair statement concerning the Department of Revenue and things like that?
I just want to make sure I understand you. So if Congress passed these policies tomorrow, it'd take 18 months to see the effects.
Yeah, their part, 12 to 18 months, because you had to collect the revenue and things like that.
Correct, but we'd see the receipts during the next budget cycle, the next fiscal year. So we would actually, I believe.
Eventually, I mean, so that'd take 6 to 8 months, it'd probably be a year to 18 months before you see the true effect.
We think we'd see the receipts at next tax season and begin to see a reduction in our deficit within that first year of implementation.
Yep. So the reason I'm saying that is that we passed the Trump tax cuts, and now they're coming into full effect. And we've seen a 5.7% growth increase, and frankly, that's because of the Trump tax cuts that happened. And it's a fair statement. And yet we want to repeal the tax cuts in this budget. I think that's really bizarre when you have a economy that's going very fast. Obviously, we have inflation, all this other stuff. And yet now we want to chop the legs off from underneath what has happened through all these tax cuts. That being said, I just want to note that a budget is a statement of values, and I tend to agree with that. And we all understand that we have an energy crisis in our country. I mean, we're all paying a tremendous amount of gas at the pump right now, and it affects every family and business. So my question is, being from Iowa, why don't we have American-made biofuels in this budget? There's not a line item or anything in here that addresses biofuels, American-made. Can you address that?
I'm happy to discuss. I believe EPA will have more details when they talk about their biofuels work. But what this president is also doing, he's released 60 million barrels of oil from the Strategic National Stockpile. We believe that is a quick way to deal with
Well, I thank you for that, but there's no biofuels. I mean, here's American-made, Iowa, Midwest biofuels, and crickets, nothing, zero in the budget. Anyway, got a question for you. In the budget proposal, you clearly lay out $2.5 trillion in new taxes on families and businesses, and then you create a side deficit-neutral reserve fund to pay for your Build Back Better priorities. But you don't really show how you do that. At the same time, it says here in this green book that your baseline includes all revenue provisions from Build Back Better, which would mean that the Biden administration is increasing taxes by $4 trillion. I'm trying to make sense of this. Is it 2.5 trillion you're increasing, or is it 4 trillion based on this book that I see and what it says?
So we are holding some revenue back for legislation that we've talked about here today to cut costs for the American people. I'll point out one thing we are not repeating in this budget, that if Congress would like to use its savings for Build Back Better, and it's the savings we get, about $600 billion to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. The AGI surtax is another thing.
But I get that, but in essence, it's 4 trillion then, because you are putting in this line item, you're showing us here that you're assuming that HR 5376 is gonna get passed, so in essence, that would be a $4 trillion increase.
Yeah, we are holding revenue for legislation
For the
that cuts
4
costs for
for the
families
$4 trillion increase.
and
Gotcha.
raising additional tax revenue in this
Gotcha.
budget.
All right, one more question. I'm worried about our seniors. I really am, about what's gonna happen in society here. And you said that you didn't do anything really to change how things are happening right now. So in essence, we're telling our seniors that our Social Security Trust Fund will be gone by 2031. You're telling Highway Trust Fund that it'll be done by 2027. Part A will be done by 2026. This is going to scare a lot of seniors, don't you think?
I think the scarier thing is if we put forth options to reduce their benefits, which this president is not going to.
I don't think anybody's asking to reduce their benefits, unless the Democrats are asking
Well,
to
there have
reduce
been
their
some
benefits, or administration
proposals
is asking
around
to
to
do their
do
benefits.
that. We're not going to do that. We think focusing on the wealthy and those making more than $400,000 is the more appropriate thing to do.
Okay, so a senior sitting at home, the budget doesn't touch this. I mean, this is scary times. I mean, if I'm them, I'm going, oh my word. I'm 68, 78, I have no more money. I have no more Social Security, Part A.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and congratulations, Director Young, for your confirmation. I want to thank you for your patience as you've been lectured about fiscal responsibility. I just want to point out, as you know, that every Democratic president since Kennedy, every Democratic administration since Kennedy has left office with a better deficit situation than they inherited, without exception. And every Republican president since then has left office with a worse deficit situation than they inherited, without exception. President Trump was well on his way to fulfilling that trend before the pandemic. And so my question is, will President Biden maintain that trend of Democratic presidents improving the deficit, notwithstanding all of the lectures you've been hearing?
So, sir, I'll repeat again, and I'm happy to report that we've seen the largest year-over-year decline in the deficit this year, $1.3 trillion in this budget. Would also further reduce the deficit by over $1 trillion in the next 10 years.
Thank you. And you've heard a lot about the $3,500 inflation that families are having to address. I think they've ignored the fact that your administration has actually done something to help them address that $3,500 burden. For a family of four, stimulus checks of $5,600 would help them pay the $3,500. Child tax credit, $6,000, will help them pay the $3,500. Improved premiums in the Affordable Care Act, increased benefits under the Earned Income Tax Credit, increased SNAP benefits, all have helped them deal with inflation. And it worked as a measure of stress. Credit card delinquencies last year, according to the Federal Reserve, are at the lowest rate they've been since they've been keeping records. You've also mentioned that you're not only helping them make the payments, you're doing something about it. You talked about the supply chain, trains, roads, and bridges. I want to thank you for your investments in the ports. Hampton Roads didn't suffer the problem, but in the California ports, they had ships all out in the out in the ocean. Those goods could have been in the market, helping to reduce prices, increase the supply. You've made those investments. You've also invested in productivity, childcare. Millions of people could go to work if we had better childcare. Job training, they can work better, and that's work too. You mentioned job creation, best job creation in history. And so you're actually doing something about it. So my question, I guess, is it better to do something about it or just sit back and complain?
Well, we're not going to do that. And so we believe, and there are legitimate differences here, but this president believes that it makes sense to bring down the cost of health care for Americans. If we're talking about inflationary pressures, look at the exorbitant amount that Americans pay on health care. We believe that we should have a legislation that brings down energy costs for Americans, and childcare you've mentioned. So I'm legitimate differences here, but this president has put forward ideas in which to deal with them.
Thank you. Better to do something about it than just complain. As you know, I chair the Committee on Education and Labor. One of the problems in education is student loan, and that is exacerbated by the erosion of the value of the Pell Grant. Are you doing anything on Pell Grants?
Mr. Scott, thank you for the omnibus bill recently passed that would up Pell Grants by $400. We also invest in Pell Grants in this budget. Through your committee, we're asking to increase the maximum Pell Grant. This president wants to double Pell Grants to get Pell Grants closer to $13,000. So both on the discretionary and mandatory side, we're asking for increases to meet the president's goals.
There's a chronic achievement gap with low-income students. Have you done anything with Title I?
Title I, again, I want to thank all of you for the omnibus, which provided record increase of $1 billion for Title I that helps our children across school districts across the country. We continue to ask for $19 billion more, so our children have access, all of our children have access to first-class education.
And in the labor space, let me ask three questions all at once. Are you doing anything for those returning from prison? Are you protecting people from discrimination with the EEOC? And with increased interest in joining unions, while the workforce at the NLRB has been declining, are you doing anything at the NLRB?
You heard we have a $45 million increase at NLRB to begin to rebuild that important agency. As far as formerly incarcerated persons, we think it is appropriate to invest to ensure it's part of our crime initiative. We're asking for $30 billion in the mandatory space to bring down crime, institute criminal justice reform, and help those formerly incarcerated become productive citizens in this country.
And the EEOC?
And EEOC asking for an increase, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, would you say that this administration is economically, financially, and fiscally incompetent and doesn't understand the consequences of this indefensible budget? Or worse, does this administration does understand the tremendous harm they're doing to the country and therefore wants to destroy the country financially and bankrupt our future?
Mr. Good, thank you for that. I don't accept either of those.
Yeah, I'm going to reclaim my time and not make you try to defend the indefensible. A small business owner within the hour just told me on the phone, he's a builder, a developer, a job created with my home district in Virginia 5, and he just said, quote, "Nothing they're doing makes sense unless they hate the country." So again, I'm going to take most of my time to speak rather than ask you to defend the indefensible, because this proposed budget exposes either the incompetence or the deviousness of this administration. You literally couldn't do more harm fiscally to the country unless you were doing it on purpose. To spend $73 trillion, God forbid Democrats ever find out what comes after a trillion, so that you spend $73 trillion over the next 10 years, a 66% increase, 66% over the previous 10-year period. For what? What is the average American going to get for this budget? What are they going to get besides higher taxes on all Americans, more debt, which will require additional higher taxes, rapidly increasing inflation, which decreases purchasing power, in effect, another higher tax on Americans, less control over their own lives and how they spend their money, decisions they make from what kind of cars they drive to how they heat their homes, and a bleaker financial future for their children and their grandchildren. This budget proposes $58 trillion in taxes, 80% increase over the previous 10 years. The only thing the Democrats do more or raise more quickly than spending is taxes, again, on all Americans. But not to worry, to any American who has the misfortune of watching this hearing, not to worry, because this budget hires 87,000 more IRS agents, America, to make sure they collect those taxes they intend to increase on all of you, and to make sure that you pay what they consider to be your fair share. I'm sure my fellow colleagues and members in this committee hear from their constituents the same thing I do. The one thing we need is more IRS agents. How about if we instead make the IRS employees actually come to work and process those outstanding tax refunds from last year? Incredibly, when we owe $30 trillion in national debt, and I'm embarrassed to say that on this committee, when I say that, I have members on the other side say, don't talk about how much we owe, because when I say it's $90,000 per citizen right now, $90,000 per citizen for 330 million Americans for $30 trillion in national debt, I get told by leadership on this committee, don't say that because we're not asking anybody to pay it back, as if it's not real, as if it's monopoly money and it doesn't matter, it doesn't count. It's already what the third largest budget item is, paying the interest on the debt. Every 1% increase in the interest rate costs us roughly $300 billion a year just to pay the debt. So I'm sure this administration, so here we got $30,000 in debt, and we actually propose or admit, we have the audacity to admit that we're going to intend to increase the national debt by another $16 trillion over 10 years. $16 trillion over 10 years, that's $50,000 per American. I submit that no American would vote for that willingly and say, yes, raise my share of the national debt by $50,000 because I'm going to get what from this budget? What American would vote for that? This budget, comparing apples to apples, it's a 30% increase, $1.4 trillion. For fiscal 23, over the last year, fiscal 20, before the government crushed the economy in the name of the China virus. So in other words, it was $4.4 trillion budget in fiscal 19. Now in fiscal 23, or fiscal 20 rather, is $4.4 trillion. Now in fiscal 23, it's $5.8 trillion, a 30% increase. Incredibly, the incompetent and irresponsible response of this administration beyond that is trillion-dollar increases in the deficit as far as the eye can see. Meanwhile, this administration, the president said it during the State of the Union speech, and you've said it already here this morning, we're trying to give ourselves a medal and pat ourselves on the back because we're going to be the first administration in the history of the country to cut the deficit by $1 trillion in a year. So just because we're not spending the ridiculous amount that was unwarranted in the name of the China virus for this, and we don't have quite that much spending in this bloated, exorbitant, massive budget proposal, Director Young, how can you keep the title of the Director of Management and Budget? Don't you think it should be called the Director of Mismanagement and Excessive Spending? I mean, is that management, is that budgeting what we're doing?
Mr. Good, if you would like a policy that cuts Medicare and Social Security, which you are promoting, either you raise revenues on the wealthy, or you
what I propose is we
Medicare
don't
and
bankrupt the
Social Security.
future of America, and we don't do it on the backs of our children, our grandchildren.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from St. Peter's for 5 minutes. Mr. Sears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, First of all, thank you for coming before this committee to answer questions about the president's budget proposal for 2023. And let me first start by saying that I love this country. I think this is the greatest country in the world. I think that there is no other country like this country, and I am eternally grateful for the opportunity to have come to this country for me and my family. So I do not hate this country. I do not hate this budget. As a matter of fact, I am pleased with the request for the robust funding levels in programs that are important to me. First of all, let's talk about affordable housing. I come from a district that affordable housing is very important. Director, do we have an increase in there?
Not only do we deal with the demand issue through increase in vouchers, we have a $50 billion mandatory proposal that ensures we deal with the lack of supply many communities have.
Thank you. Do we have an increase for security of communities with police?
$3.2 billion, including a $300 million increase for cops, as well as a $30 billion multi-year proposal to deal with community violence.
So that goes along with what the president said. There is no cut in policing, right?
There's an increase for policing.
There is an increase. Thank you very much. Do we have an increase for Pell Grants? Something that's very important to my district, especially people who I represent.
Absolutely, sir. We believe that is the path to making college affordable for those amongst us that can't afford college and leave college in debt, and we're on the path to doubling the maximum Pell Grant.
Thank you, Director. And under this president, do we have an increase in infrastructure spending? Because my whole state in New Jersey is one big transportation hub, and it's a very aged infrastructure. And I am very happy to see that the infrastructure bill was passed and the increase that we're seeing. So do we have an investment in infrastructure in this country?
Yeah, we continue our investments through increases in Department of Transportation, 6% over the 21 levels, in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and some of those investments in the housing supplies we've talked about.
Thank you, Director. And I know that every time we increase, the Democrats increase defense funding is never enough. But do we have an increase in defense funding spending in this bill?
The Department of Defense would see a 4% increase over the omnibus level.
But obviously, when it's the Democrats that increase, it's never enough. And I have to ask you one more question, which is important to me. People always criticize the undocumented, the people that are working in this country that do not have documents. Do they contribute to Social Security?
Many of them do, and many of them pay local taxes and contribute to their communities.
Now, and many of them do not collect their Social Security when they retire, right?
It would be difficult. I don't know how they would do that without proper paperwork.
So that's money that goes into our budget. Would you know how many billions of dollars that is?
No, sir, but I'm happy to see what we have and can provide it for the record.
Yeah, I would appreciate if you would do that, because, you know, I know it's as much as $9 and $10 billion that they never collect because they either go back to their country or they're just not allowed to collect it.
That is correct, Congressman. That's my understanding of how that would work. If they paid into the system, there would be no way to get funding out of the system.
Well, I just want to say thank you for this budget. Thank you for you being here so we can ask you all these questions. I'm sure that in your 26 years of work in this field, you have developed enough experience to be called director of the budget office. Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Per our agreement with Director Young, the committee will recess briefly. Without objection, the committee will stand in recess subject to the call of the chair. I request that members return at 12:30 p.m. so the hearing may proceed. Sorry about that. The committee will come to order. We will now continue with the hearing, the question and answer period, and I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Iowa, Mrs. Hinson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Director Young, for coming before us today. I look forward to hearing your answers to our questions. I'd like to start off by thanking our ranking member, Smith, for pointing out that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will expire as a part of this budget, raising taxes on working families in Iowa. It raises taxes on our small businesses, on firefighters, on teachers, on shift workers building tractors, and on the healthcare heroes who have dedicated their lives to making others healthy, especially through a pandemic. We're going to reward them with a tax increase. I just finished my 5th 20-county tour across the district, held a telephone town hall last night. There is a clear, consistent theme from my constituents, what I'm hearing on the ground, what I heard on that last night, and that is the concern about rising prices. So whether it's farm repairs, farm inputs, the price at the pump for gas, the increases in everyday goods like groceries, bacon, milk, working families are struggling right now to continue to put food on the table, and that is largely because of the administration's policies. And we know increased federal spending is driving up these costs, and yet the president's budget request proposes $73 trillion in spending over the next 10 years with a projected $14 trillion impact on the deficit. That's a tab that is up to the next generation to have to pay. We're leaving that for them. Inflation today is at 7.9%, the highest it's been in 4 decades, and yet the president's budget plan assumes inflation will only be 2.3% through the next foreseeable future here, all the way to 2032. This is just out of touch, and we've heard why that is so. But I asked you a little bit about this same issue last year. Here we are a year later with even worse inflation than what we had a year ago. So my question is, why is the administration continuing to make these claims that are out of touch about inflation, low inflation here, high inflation with what we're paying at the grocery store and what consumers are actually facing, because that's affecting Iowans every single day?
Yeah, we hear you, Mrs. Hinson, and we share your concerns. We might disagree on the proposals to get inflation under control, but the president's concerned about these cost pressures on Americans. You mentioned farmers. We have worked at the administration, for example, to ensure that those who work farms can, for example, fix their own equipment. We have found that there's not competition always, and people have
Right
to
to
go.
repair is a completely different issue from what I'm asking about here. I'm asking why specifically you're not being accurate in your accounting of inflation here. Because, I mean, if you're making a budget projection based on numbers that are wrong, that's irresponsible and disrespectful to taxpayers.
Well, actually, the numbers were baked in November. That's how budgets work. We have to close the books at some point and send you a budget. But I hope you know that inflation both has an offsetting effect. Both revenues usually go up with higher inflation, as well as spending. Therefore, the long-term projections are not affected by a different inflation rate. But you're absolutely right. It is higher than our estimates were in November when we locked what we affectionately call a database.
Well, I hope going forward that we can be cognizant of the fact that those numbers are inaccurate. So as we as a committee are continuing to work with you and your office, being cognizant that these numbers are not right is going to be crucial as we're making the right decisions. I'm glad you mentioned farmers in this administration because Americans are struggling with the cost of fuel. This includes billions of dollars in funding for EVs and charging infrastructure. These taxpayer dollars do nothing to actually drive down the cost of fuel for Iowans, but the subsidies will make inflation even worse. And on the campaign trail, the president came to Iowa and looked Iowans in the eye and said he could count on him for a new era of biofuels, quoting the president here, "Lip service won't make up for nearly 4 years of retroactive damage that has decimated our trade economy and forced ethanol plants to shutter." So we've heard that it's already not in this budget, but I'm wondering why? Why is it not in this budget? Why does the administration break their promise here to Iowans and Americans to not support the usage of renewable biofuels, domestic fuels, domestic energy production like ethanol?
Thank you for bringing this up, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to fully address this with Mr. Feenstra. This budget, as you all know, starts October 1. Many of the inflationary increases we're seeing in gas have to do with the Russia-Ukraine situation. We have to deal with that fluid situation before this budget even takes effect. So we are happy with the $13 billion this Congress provided to help with assistance to Ukraine, but the gas situation, in addition to selling 60 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we'll also be looking to other things in which to bring down costs for Americans, but that's going to be before this budget takes effect.
Well, we're looking at, obviously, projections here for many years out, so I think Iowans want to know why it's not included. If you're having conversations about all these other things in the future, why is biofuels noticeably missing? My final question, we've had, obviously, 2 million encounters at the southern border. We saw some increased funding for CBP in the omnibus and a supplemental there, but we're back at square one here with these cuts, to propose cuts to the CBP. So again, why is that happening?
You see actually a 5% increase to DHS, including for agents. Many in our party will disagree, but we believe there is a necessity for additional personnel to ensure that we have an orderly immigration system. In addition to that, we have an increase for immigration judges to make sure we move people through the legal system. So we absolutely have put forth what we believe is a balanced approach to deal with the border.
Well,
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
thank you, I yield
Let's
back.
go. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Director Young, thank you so much for being here with us. A lot of my questions are about modernization, how we face the future and meet the challenges and opportunities that it presents. Can you talk to me for a second about how we're modernizing our military, our national security? Here we are watching Russian tanks get destroyed by drones on TV. One of the biggest threats that Americans face from this ongoing war in Ukraine is the threat of cyber attacks here at home. And our biggest adversary in the world is China. China has not only invested in future capabilities like advanced missile systems, space systems, and artificial intelligence, but they've made important cuts to make those investments possible. We used to, quite frankly, be thrilled that China had a 1 million-man army because it wasn't that good. Well, they've cut that army to invest in future capabilities. How is the administration meeting that challenge?
Thank you for that. And we are increasing the Department of Defense budget by 4%. It is in line with the National Defense Strategy. Last year, the administration was new, still working on how we saw the military of the future. But we are investing more in AI. We are investing in hypersonics. In addition to legacy equipment, F-35s, submarines that many of you are interested in. So we have to do both. We have to invest in our traditional capability as well as look to the future, including our cyber threats.
It's often been said that Congress gets in the way of the cuts we need to make to invest in the future. Would you agree with that?
Out of deference to my former place of employment, I'm just going to say this is the beginning of a process, and I look forward to working with you throughout it.
Well, if you won't agree to my statement, I will. I think we have a lot of work to do here to make sure that we're not just protecting parochial interests at the expense of our national security. China is also trying to outcompete us in foreign aid by attacking really one of our strengths, and that's the allies, the partnerships that we have around the globe. You can look at how much they're investing in places like Africa. This budget puts $682 million towards Ukraine support, is that correct?
That is correct, but remember, that is the longer-term objective. What we're really using for the enhanced humanitarian aid now is the $13 billion Congress thankfully provided to us earlier this month.
It's amazing to compare $682 million that we're investing or proposed to invest in Ukraine with the amount that Trump proposed investing in Ukraine when he tried to blackmail Zelensky, which was exactly zero. Director Young, it's also important that we take this opportunity, having passed this historic infrastructure bill, to invest in the future of transportation. Is it the administration's position that we should invest in modes and investments that have a high ROI, a high return on investment for the American taxpayer?
That's what we believe. We also believe projects should have high benefit cost ratios. And we certainly have put out guidance at the consternation of some that does try to focus our transportation in innovative, modernizing ways.
I mean, I would point out that high-speed rail has some of the highest ROIs in transportation. which frankly is why the rest of the world is investing in it. China has built in just the last 12 years the largest high-speed rail system in the world. Are you familiar with the size of the United Kingdom's budget compared to our own?
I'm not, actually.
Well, the United Kingdom, a country that is 1/40th our size, is investing $120 billion on a single high-speed rail line to the north of the country. How does that compare with our investments in high-speed rail?
I mean, clearly, Mr. Moulton, we have to work with Congress, as you pointed out, that represents many different parts of the country.
Well, I would just say that if America is 40 times bigger than the United States, we shouldn't be moving around much more slowly than the rest of the world. The Brits can go 3 times as fast as we can on our interstate system on their new high-speed rail line. Investing in more highways creates more traffic jams. Investing in a lot of electric vehicles makes those traffic jams silent, but we still have a lot of traffic jams. So we have passed this historic infrastructure bill. I think the administration has an opportunity to truly make this investments for the future. We can build more 1950s era trains and railways, or we can build for the future, and I hope you take that opportunity.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director, thanks for being here. I really do appreciate it. Obviously, you know, a budget in 5 minutes, we're not going to be able to deconstruct this entire thing. So let's try to focus in. Number one, the corporate tax increase, the corporate tax rate under your budget, under the president's budget, excuse me, goes up to 28%. Is it the administration's belief that an increase in the corporate tax rate will have no impact on an already inflationary environment with higher prices for consumers?
We don't believe it will change the operations of how corporations make decisions. No, we don't.
But no, the question, Director Young, is does the administration believe that higher corporate income taxes will force an increase in prices in an already inflationary environment that a lot of people actually really believe now is unleashed by the American Rescue Plan from last February?
Mr. Donalds, we do not believe that is the case.
Okay, so the administration doesn't think that higher taxes are going to lead to higher prices on top of an already inflationary environment?
For corporations, are you assuming they pass on their tax rates on
Director,
to?
you're wrong. Corporations always pass on the cost increases. They're doing it with inflationary costs, with the ability to get their products right now, the portions that they need to create their products to sell to consumers. When the cost of freight is up, the cost of wheat is up, the cost of oil is up, that's all being passed through. Yes or no?
Mr. Donalds, I don't believe, and we don't believe as administration, that asking corporations to pay 28%, they used to pay 35% before the last tax cuts, will increase inflationary pressures.
Director Young, does the administration acknowledge the fact that when the corporate tax rate was cut from 35 to 21, that the United States raised more revenue in corporate income taxes than at any other point in American history?
What we saw was a continued use of legal loopholes that prevented, I mentioned this earlier, 50 corporations, the Fortune 500, from paying any taxes.
I'm not talking about the uses of what's already in the tax code. I actually would argue that if we're going to have a fair code, we should adopt a flat tax or a fair tax. I mean, I don't think that's the administration's position. That's my position, if we're going to have a fair code. But to talk about what they use in the current legal structure of the tax code, you can't make that argument and say that, oh, well, they're using these things. I'm talking about did the government raise more revenue from corporate income taxes, yes or no?
And corporations continue to make more. That is the
All right,
point.
let's move on, because I know we're not going to get anywhere there. In your proposal, I'm reading like the expanded explanations here.
You're reading the Green Book.
Yes, I'm reading the Green Book right now. Right now, we have a serious situation in the United States associated with gas prices and rising oil prices, which is going to impact every American, whether they are rich or poor, whether they are black and white. The one thing that will be consistent is that it will affect everybody. There will be no inequality associated with rising energy prices. In your budget proposal, the administration is actually saying that they're going to unwind every tax benefit associated with fossil fuels in the United States. Does the administration believe that completely eviscerating all oil and natural gas tax treatments that we've had in our country, frankly, for 30, 40 years, do they believe that that will actually lead to lower prices on oil and natural gas.
We don't believe the tax structure offered will lead to increased gas prices, but you're right, Mr. Donalds, we have to do something to bring down the cost. But I hope you would agree that costs have gone up since the Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Director Young, we have to acknowledge that oil prices have been up far before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine on February 24.
But a dollar
The price of a barrel of oil was up significantly. The price of gas was roughly $3.64, 65 cents on average in the United States. That was already significantly higher than what it's been over the last 4 years in the United States. Do you acknowledge that?
I acknowledge that there were increased energy prices that have further increased since Russian aggression.
Director Young, okay. So we understand that prices are higher now since February 24. We are going to acknowledge for the record that prices have been higher under the president's administration currently. The president has talked about how he wants to get away from fossil fuels. Is the administration's position that essentially eliminating all tax treatment, which makes oil and gas production in the United States far easier, that's actually going to be to the betterment of the United States from an energy perspective going forward in the country?
Mr. Donalds, we think we need a comprehensive approach. I would remind everyone here, our country is one of the three, before Russia took this route, that produce over 10 million barrels a month. This country does not have an oil production problem.
Quick follow-up on that. That's under current tax treatment. I would argue that if the tax treatment on oil and gas companies goes up, we are going to have a production problem. But to that point, one of the main talking points from the administration is that you want an economy that works for everyone. You want a tax system that is fair. Is it fair for the green energy portion of energy in the United States to have significantly more favorable tax treatment than oil and natural gas?
As we know, these are developing systems. We need to ensure that those systems, as many
So
systems
it's
in
okay
this
for oil and
country
natural
have
gas to be
received,
treated unfairly?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Oh, we were getting to the answer, Chairman. Come on now, give me.
Well, no,
come on, Chairman, we were good.
I'll let her answer, but you can't continue the
All
debate.
right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, please.
And Mr. Yarmouth, thank you. And by the way, many of the subsidies for people who want to buy electric vehicles, this is to help consumers. Many consumers want solar panels. Many consumers want electric vehicles. The government, we believe, the best way to help them achieve that and also a cleaner world is to provide subsidies through our tax system.
Gentleman's time
Chairman,
has
cut me off.
expired.
I'm good. Thanks, Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman.
time has
Thank you,
expired.
Director
Mr.
Young.
Donalds.
As always, you have the opportunity to submit questions in writing to the director that she can then subsequently answer for the record. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, it is great to see you and to call you director. Congratulations again on your appointment. And I wanted to say, first of all, that there are many things in this budget that we appreciate, including the taxes on the wealthiest. As you know, I'm a lead sponsor of the Ultra Millionaire Tax Act. We also appreciate the restrictions on stock buybacks, as well as some of the immigration provisions that you mentioned earlier, the investment in judges, the legal counsel, and community-based alternatives to detention. We appreciate all of those things, so thank you for those. Switching gears, America has a monopoly crisis that's strangling small businesses and hurting people's pocketbooks, while corporations have made immense profits through pandemic profiteering and price gouging. And I was very pleased to see the historic increases to the antitrust division and to FTC to robustly enforce our antitrust laws. But that's just one piece. As you know, we have very bipartisan efforts here in Congress to give federal agencies more tools to ensure competition. Director Young, do you agree that those efforts should be prioritized?
We do, and that's why we talked earlier, increasing competition is one way. We have to deal with inflation in this country, and why you see a $273 million request for the Antitrust Division and Department of Justice, $88 million increase, 48% over 2021, and a $498 million request, or a 40% increase over 2021 for the FTC.
Thank you. And I also appreciate the Department of Justice's recent letter stating the department's views that the, quote, rise of dominant platforms presents a threat to open markets and competition. And we're looking forward to moving our package along. Now, you won't be surprised to know that I need to express my deep concern with the 4% increase in defense spending. This is on top of the unprecedented increase over the president's fiscal 22 request that just became law. Director Young, can you tell me how much the Pentagon has given to just 5 contractors?
Are we just picking contractors? I'm sure
5
I can,
largest contractors.
get back to you, Congresswoman, on the top contractors I assume you're interested in.
Let me tell you that up to 1/3 of Pentagon contracts after 9/11 went to just 5 contractors. And from fiscal year 2001 to 2020, these companies received $2.1 trillion in 2021 dollars. And in fiscal year 2020 alone, the Pentagon gave $75 billion in contracts to Lockheed Martin, which totals more than 1.5 times the entire budgets of the State Department and USAID. Director Young, is the Pentagon the only federal agency that has never passed an audit?
I believe that's correct.
So, and it's actually failed its last 4 audits, and yet we are continuing to pile money on top. And I would just say that to Representative Moulton's questions, I would argue that there are more efficient ways to spend the money we have. It doesn't mean that we can't have solid and secure national security if we actually cut out waste, fraud, and abuse and focus on the technologies that are going to provide us with the biggest bang for the buck. And yet, it seems that our only strategy on military spending is bigger is better. Do you think that bigger is better forever and ever, Director Young?
I think a defense budget has to be strategy-based. Congresswoman, you have been a long-time advocate here on getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse in the Department of Defense. That is accurate. But we've also heard from the other side of the aisle who believe our number isn't large enough. That is why we believe the right thing to do here is use the long-term defense strategy to build our budget.
Director Young, what, I assume that the other side also would agree that we don't want waste, fraud, and abuse in our Pentagon budget. And I remember last year or last term under a Republican president, we actually had a Republican budget director come and testify that the Pentagon should pass an audit. What work is going on to make sure that the Pentagon passes a budget before we continue to increase military spending indiscriminately just to thump the patriotic banner and say that somehow because we're increasing military spending, even though we can't pay for our veterans here at home, even though we can't invest in education in the ways that we want, even though we're having debates around whether or not we have enough money for childcare, something the president has advocated for, by the way, more childcare. But as we have those debates, how are we going to make sure that the taxpayer dollars that we are spending are actually going to an audited agency that has cut out waste, fraud, and abuse?
There's no reasonable person who would disagree that the Pentagon should be able to pass a basic audit. But I do want to reiterate, we think the need here is to put forward a budget that is tied to a national strategy. Whether or not you agree with the strategy is another thing, but as you've heard, there are a lot of opinions on what the defense number should be.
Director Young, you know how I've been advocating on this for a long time, and I just don't understand. There's nothing that is contradictory to a national defense strategy when we talk about making sure the Pentagon passes an audit and cuts out waste, fraud, and abuse before we heap more dollars on it. So thank you again for your tremendous service to our country and the role that you currently occupy and everything you've done before this. And I hope we can work together to actually make taxpayer dollars mean something instead of just profits.
Gentlewoman's
to
time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Carey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, Director. Appreciated the conversation we had yesterday by phone. Thank you very much. In going through all of the information that I've received, I just want to make a few points and then I'll ask my question. Number one, it's what is said and what is not said. In going through the document, I realized that there is zero mention, I think Congressman Klein brought this up, zero mention of a debt crisis or an inflation crisis. Yet, it mentions climate crisis over 33 times. Some of the other mentions that I found interesting, it mentions tax, fee, or penalty 127 times. It does not mention the Keystone Pipeline, nor does it mention any plans for new domestic oil and natural gas production, while it mentions 27 times greenhouse, and 187 mentions of climate. Now, you've had a lot of questions today with regards to the price of gas, but again, I'm going to go back to just some of the other things. In this document, there are 0 mentions of border security in the budget. 0 mentions. There are 4 mentions of police. 0 mentions of parents in the budget as well. So again, just some things that I have observed as the newest person on this committee, the things that have been mentioned and the things that haven't. But my question is going to be this, really simple. How does this budget spend for other countries to combat climate change?
We are making a historic investment, about $11 billion in our international climate pledge to ensure that low-income countries who do emit can join all of us in the developing world in bringing down their pollution, so our kids, future generations, have a earth to call home.
Follow-up to that, Mr. Chairman. What is the total level of funding provided, including tax incentives, for climate-related policies in this budget?
Congressman, we devote about $45 billion in climate activities. I'll get our exhibit to you. I don't want to misquote where we are in the budget, but I'm happy to provide that on the record so you have specific numbers.
One last thing, wrote the question down, let me make sure I have it, so I said it correctly. There was also a provision, here it is. Would any of the $30 billion in mandatory spending to prevent, combat and prevent crime be used to enforce gun control on any of the U.S. citizens?
The idea, not on the $30 billion pot is really supposed to be a comprehensive look and provide state and locals with the tools, including psychiatrists, mental health. But we do have increases in ATF to make sure that ghost guns and other guns that find themselves into the hands of criminals, that we do something about that.
Another question. How will spending $1.4 million on a new Office of Environmental Justice at DOJ help our law enforcement agencies do their job and tackle the crime crisis in America?
I think we have to tackle the crime crisis in America while we tackle an environmental justice system. I read in the New York Times, there's one county, I won't say what state, where people's sewage actually goes into their backyard. They've never had a sewage system at their homes. People of color, low income, we think something is wrong with that.
And that should be part of the law enforcement agencies.
Where there are illegal activities, DOJ absolutely needs the tools to make sure all Americans are treated equally under the law, even when there are environmental issues.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Director.
Thank
You
you.
answered my questions, and I appreciate your time.
Appreciate it.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young, for being here today to discuss this budget proposal, and of course, congratulations on your confirmation. And you and I have talked about a couple of these issues I want to raise. I represent mid-Michigan. I do appreciate the focus of this proposal on infrastructure, on strengthening the middle class, on supporting law enforcement in particular, which is important in the communities that I represent, and for doing what we can to lower costs for families. I was, as I've expressed to you, disappointed that the budget request calls for funding the Flint Registry at a lower level than was passed in the most recent government funding legislation. And for those who are not familiar, the Flint Registry is run through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It was created by Congress to respond to the water crisis in my hometown and to connect families to health care, to nutrition, to lead removal services, to do the things that they need to do to minimize the impact of lead exposure on their health. It's a powerful tool. It's improving the lives of people who suffered through this terrible moment. And it also helps other communities, Benton Harbor, Michigan, most recently Newark, New Jersey. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022, which is the bipartisan government funding bill, included $5 million in funding for the registry. So the Michigan delegation, Democrats and Republicans, support this, and I just ask if if the administration will support fully funding the Flint Lead Registry so that we don't have to reduce that commitment that we're making to the families of Flint.
Absolutely, Mr. Kildee. You've heard many times we talk about the earliness in which we have to do things to get a budget to you.
Right.
I will say the Flint Registry was a result of that. We did not have time to incorporate many of the omnibus final decisions. We absolutely support. We talk about environmental justice. How can we support many environmental justice things without fully supporting Flint? And so you have my and the administration's full support.
Thank you for that. And it is a good example of when we invest in environmental justice, as you have in the proposed budget, perhaps we avoid the very high cost, both in human and financial cost, that the people of Flint have experienced. So thank you for that effort. One other issue that I do want to raise, and it has to do, and again, you and I have spoken about this, the Delphi salaried retirees. When GM filed for bankruptcy during the Great Recession, the PBGC unfairly, in the minds of myself and many others, cut as much as 70% for 20,000 Delphi salaried retirees, more than 5,000 in Michigan. The PBGC assumed responsibility for the terminated benefits, but couldn't pay more than the statutory benefit would allow. These salaried workers suffered significant losses to their benefits. They were, I believe, unfairly targeted in the discharge of that bankruptcy. I've introduced legislation, the Susan Muffley Act, along with Senator Brown of Ohio. It's bipartisan legislation that would restore the benefits to these retirees. A bankruptcy, by the way, which was largely engineered by the U.S. government, so we do bear responsibility. These pensioners have been fighting for the restoration of their benefits for a long time. Can we work with you to ensure that Congress and the administration together deliver the restoration of these hard-earned benefits to the Delphi salaried retirees?
Mr. Kildee, thank you for your long work on this. I've told you privately, I'll tell you publicly, we're happy to take a look at the legislation. We want to work the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, but we know those pensioners work their entire careers and deserve their pensions. So we absolutely will work with you and provide whatever assistance we can.
I thank you for that. And as we've discussed, I mean, the Delphi salary retirees have exhausted other remedies, and so that's why we're at this place where I think action by Congress is important, and we just want to be able to see the administration as a partner in helping us get this resolution through to the President's desk. So I thank you for that, and I thank you for your testimony and all the great work you're doing. Again, congratulations.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Wow. Great. Thank you for coming over here. Not all of our witnesses nowadays come over and see us in person, so I'd like to thank you for that.
Second year in a row, sir.
Very good. Little comment before, I think there was a comment that the 17% increase in AmeriCorps might not be quite enough. I'll point out, given the current situation, nobody should ever get a 17%. Nobody should even get a 5% increase, so whatever. There's my comment. I recently was looking at some graphs, and in them it showed that the there are different measures of the monetary supply, but M2 might not be the best measurement. But recently it's been up 40% year over year. And I'm old enough to remember the inflation of the 70s. At the time, M2 was going up about 7% a year, and that was considered out of line. So I'm just alarmed out of my mind that we have so much money apparently being printed by the Federal Reserve at this time. And of course, one can try to blame it on something else, but I think clearly the inflation, which I think is well over 7%, because when I talk to my farmers or talk to my manufacturers, their costs of production are frequently up 80, 90%. So I can't help but think when their final product gets to market, it's going to be a lot more than 7%. But could you comment on the massive increase in the money supply? Do you think that might have something to do with inflation? And don't you believe with the relatively high spending in this budget that the money supply is going to go up even more, which means inflation is going to go up more?
So, sir, you probably know this and it'll be frustrating, but we leave monetary policy for the Fed for exactly the reason we don't want monetary policy to be subsumed in our great political process, and it is outside of that process. So I will leave monetary policy for the Reserve, and I'm sure they have the tools in which to manage most of our inflation crisis. But I've gone over what the president believes we can do from an administration to deal with this. I'd also point out many have talked about the ARP legislation. I sat with Moody's economists yesterday who truly believe that we would have seen a double-dip recession had it not been for ARP. But we may have different solutions, but we agree we have to do something to bring down pressures on pocketbook issues for Americans.
I guess I would think that, well, ultimately it's up to the Fed to make those decisions. When we pass budgets with sizable deficits, I think the Fed may feel they're in a corner and can't do anything else but print more money. But in any event, am I correct in looking at this budget that the non-defense discretionary spending, and I assume we're going to pass bills separate from the budget as well, or separate from the regular appropriation bills, is up about 12%?
From the omnibus, it is up about 9.5%, with defense up about 4%.
Okay, you're saying, do you think, given the huge amount of debt and the huge increase in the money supply, that it's prudent to spend 10%, 9.6% on non-defense discretionary spending? Doesn't that alarm you? Or when you began to put this document together, what was your target number?
So remember, Mr. Grothman, the president is offering to pay for his proposals. So we are putting forth spending with tax reform. I get that many may disagree with our tax proposals, but he does believe we should pay for our proposals. And this budget would show over $1 trillion decrease in deficits over 10 years.
Okay. And what is it based on, a projected inflation, or projected, because inflation determines kind of what type of inflation are you, or interest rates are you guessing when you put together the budget 10 years out?
So the inflation rates, or the
I'll say interest rates, yeah.
The interest rates we're using now are lower than in the budget, because we did it in November, are about 2.1% for this year. Right now, I think we're really around 2.3, so we're slightly lower than interest rates. But we do believe over the 10-year period, we're still paying a lower interest rate than historic norms.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a little more of a bipartisan question. You're raising the corporate rate here to 28%, and in something I kind of disagree with the Republicans on. Historically, because we are in a worldwide competitive situation, we treated manufacturing a little bit different, because manufacturers have to compete with other businesses abroad, and I think in a variety of ways we're seeing the problems that come when we're not competitive manufacturing with other countries. When probably more likely have to be done with some bill through reconciliation, but would you be open to the idea that we go back to the old system in which manufacturing, and I think Barack Obama was in favor of this, I think Hillary was too, might be wrong on that, that the tax rate for manufacturing would, since they've got to compete abroad, would be lower than the tax rate for other sort of businesses, or there's some sort of credit for manufacturing.
Gentleman's time has expired. The witness may respond.
Thank you. Mr. Grothman, I really ask you to pay close attention to the global minimum tax proposal. You might have seen Secretary Yellen met with other countries to ensure exactly that people don't move a lot of these manufacturing bases to other countries who pay their workers less, have low or no tax rate. We believe that global minimum will help bring jobs back to the U.S.
The gentleman's time has expired. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much for the opportunity. Very, very important. Ms. Young, let me acknowledge that the nation is better off for the leadership of President Joe Biden and, in fact, your leadership and support in his efforts. Let me immediately start by headlines that I've heard from some of the papers that we read here on the Hill, and you're a Hill pro, that says that this is a building the deficit and spending budget. And I take issue with that. First of all, would you comment on the alternative minimum tax or the minimum tax as to what it actually does. As you well know, I have two or three questions, and your brevity would help with that. But I just want to get the frame this particular aspect of the budget. Thank you.
I believe you're speaking of the billionaire minimum tax. Billionaires pay about 8% tax rate, and other regular Americans, nurses, firefighters, teachers pay at least double that. So we would like them to pay a minimum rate closer to what most Americans pay.
So you're speaking about fairness and equity, if I can hear you correctly.
That is correct.
What will it do for the budget, the revenue that may come in?
Thank you for that. That is why this budget is deficit reducing. So we are looking to reduce the deficit, are on track to reduce the deficit $1.3 trillion this year, and reduce even further by over $1 trillion with these policies.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Chairman, I want to introduce in the record a child care need under the 2019 Texas Child Care Facts that is produced by Child Aware. Ask unanimous consent to place in the record.
Without objection.
In my state, there are about 1,812,000 families in poverty, but here's a big number. Children under 6, 1,372,687 who are needing child care. Let me briefly comment on the investment you made, $7.6 billion in discretionary funding for child care and development block grant. Tell me how it would get to the children in Texas, 1 million of them under 6 needing child care.
Not only do we support that amount, the $7.6 billion, as you talked about, it will go to the states to help a lot of child care businesses. As you know, during the pandemic, many couldn't keep their doors open. So families, especially women, are finding they can't re-enter the workforce, and we have to do something about that.
So a clarion call to my constituents in Houston who are part of the 1.6 million children needing child care. This may enhance their opportunity and their opportunity for women to get back into the workforce.
That and Congresswoman, I'd also point that the president has been supportive of child care as part of further legislation still under consideration. This would be one part.
Absolutely, and we support that to ensure a 7% cap on any family's child care costs. Let me just thank the administration quickly for its COVID actions. Unlike the awkward and unprepared of the last administration, you have a 11.6 billion as it deals with the pandemic and public health preparedness. How important is that as my time runs out? I've got a few more questions.
So that looks at future pandemics, so we aren't left in the same predicament we were if another pandemic were to occur. We need to invest in future pandemics.
Thank you. That's going to go a long way to rural hospitals, local urban hospitals, and others dealing with pandemic increases that may come in the near future. I chair the crime subcommittee on judiciary, very interested in the question of reduction of crime. That would include enhancing training or responses to law enforcement, but more importantly as well, the complementary support of mental health support, support to stem the tide of domestic violence. What is the administration doing on that? Very quickly.
The budget would propose $56 million to issue grants to support behavioral health services to individuals within or during reentry from jails and prisons. Also asking for $500 million to be split between DOJ and HHS with the recognition that there has to be a comprehensive answer to crime, not just from the law enforcement standpoint.
Well, the one thing we know is that the administration and Democrats are not soft on crime, and that we recognize that we must be in the crime reducing business. I want to thank you for your support of public housing. And so my final questions are public housing emphasis, and then the commitment of the administration for taking refugees from Ukraine under the present capping that we have not utilized. I'd appreciate your answers to those two questions.
As you know, we have a robust housing supply initiative, $50 billion on the mandatory side to ensure we have affordable housing. Also, as you point out, the budget provides funding to resettle 125,000 refugees in 2023, including the commitment for Ukrainians that the president recently announced.
I look forward to working with you on these matters. And Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. This is a robust, important budget for the American people, and it is a deficit-busting budget, and we need to move forward on the president's goals. Thank you so very much for your leadership. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Director Young, congratulations on your confirmation. Thank you for the introductory phone call. It was very nice getting to know you. I'm certainly looking forward to working with you. So I'd like to continue a line of questioning that a number of the other members of the panel have raised about the assumptions that were made on the rate of inflation when the budget was created. So my understanding is that the rate of inflation that was assumed for this year is 4.7%. Obviously, we're trending towards nearly twice that. And for the rest of the budgetary forecast was 2.3%, which I think the Federal Reserve and most every economist would agree it's going to be substantially more than that. And you've explained that that was because the budget was crafted in November before the recent spike in inflation. Do I have all that right?
That's correct.
So I'm curious as to, because I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, as members of this panel on both sides of the aisle have testified, I'm hopeful that we can actually do what Congress is meant to do, take this budget and craft an actual budget proposal out of it and pass that budget. So we have to rely on the figures that you're giving us and try and craft our own budget out of that. What changes do you think the fact that the assumptions that you made about inflation when you crafted the budget were incorrect, what effect do you think that has on the numbers in the budget?
As I mentioned earlier, inflation has an offsetting mechanism. So typically with higher inflation, revenues are also higher. So we believe our debt and deficit targets remain about the same. I'd also point out it's a 10-year budget. Our long-term inflation numbers are still in line with private forecasters. And I point out the word forecasters. Just like the government forecast estimates, so do the private markets, and the long-term estimates are still in line with those private forecasters.
Okay, so the Department of Labor just recently came out with statistics showing that real wage growth is actually negative by about 2.5% right now. And the Congressional Budget Office says that actually is going to have, as inflation goes up, that has a negative effect on budgets, because although revenues go up, they don't go up enough to compensate for higher expenses. And as the interest rates rise, a greater percent of the budget has to be spent on debt service. So would you say that, given the fact that actual inflation is running about twice what the assumption was, would you say that the long-term deficit reduction is going to be the same?
It'll be about the same, but you're right. The more interest rates, not inflation, goes up. I was speaking to inflation on interest rates. You're right, that does have an impact on what you pay in debt service. We also look at what the historical rates are and what we pay on the debt based on historical averages. We're still in line. We're paying less than historical norms on debt service. And even with higher interest rates, by the way, Mr. Obernolte, our budget does account for. We account for interest rates growing in this budget.
Well, I think we all join you in hoping that the rate that we have to pay on our national debt does not go up substantially. But pessimistically, I'm not sure that that's going to be the case. So long term, I was very happy to see the president concentrating on deficit reduction. Certainly was not the case with his proposed budget last year. That's a concern that many of us on this panel have. One of the things that you touted in your opening statement about the budget is that it's going to reduce the deficit by over $1 trillion over the forecasting period. But I wanted to be clear, you're talking about cumulatively, because our deficit is about 1.3 trillion right now. So we're not going to reduce it from 1.3 to 0.3. We're going to reduce it by $1 trillion over that 10-year forecast period.
So there are two deficit numbers I talked about, and they're important to get right. We're on track, absent this budget, to reduce the deficit by $1.3 trillion year over year, the largest ever decline in 1 year. The budget policies represent, if Congress takes them up, we believe another $1 trillion in deficit reduction.
Total, over the 10-year period.
Correct.
So, I mean, $100 billion a year, not $1 trillion in a single year.
Right.
So we're still going to have a substantial deficit by the end of the forecast period.
But remember, we're also looking at bringing down the deficit $1.3 trillion in 1 year.
We're on the same team here. Well, let me ask you about that, actually, as kind of a final question here. As I said, I was very encouraged to see the president focusing on deficit reduction. As director of the OMB, what's your long-term philosophy on that? Do you think that we need to get to a balanced budget, and if so, how do we do that?
Mr. Obalnotti, I think, and a lot of economists think, the better measure to look at than to try to get to zero debt, because you know this, the most spending in this budget are beneficiaries, to Social Security, to Medicare, and to ensure that we preserve those benefits for our elderly or those close to make sure they get those benefits. We believe the more appropriate thing to do is look at whether the debt level is crowding out the country's ability to make investments. We don't think we're at that point. There's not a specific number that makes sense. You can't just say 60 trillion gets to be too much or 40 or 50. It really is, it's dependent on the size of the economy. And we believe we can handle the debt service payments given that interest rates remain historically low, even if rising.
Well, on that, we might disagree, but I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Yep, gentleman's time has
He's been here a
expired.
long time, so thank you, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman.
absolutely, yeah. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Director Young, thank you so much for being here today. I just want to start off with a few quick questions. First of all, what is the current national debt?
The current debt is about 24 trillion.
I have about $30 trillion. How much would each American citizen have to pay to cover that debt?
That's not how debts work, so we have not calculated that.
Thank you, my time, Director. The answer is $91,207 per American citizen. How much does each taxpayer, thank you, how much does each taxpayer owe to cover our current $30 trillion debt, not $24 trillion?
And I'm sorry, I have 22.3, so I'll correct myself downward since we're using different numbers. Again, we don't calculate the debt by person, including my
Reclaiming my time,
5-month-old. Thank you.
excuse me, Director. The answer is $242,500 per taxpayer in America. Now, you may have been on track with some of these answers if your numbers were correct with the $30 trillion debt that we actually are at right now. But I would have hoped that you would have the correct answers in your position to all of these questions, as the president and this regime really should keep this debt at the forefront of our thinking in proposing a budget. But this budget that was created is proposed to spend another $5.8 trillion this fiscal year and $73 trillion over the next 10 years. And sadly, it's pretty apparent that you're more concerned with continuing to spend trillions of dollars of taxpayer money on liberal wish lists rather than doing anything substantive to rein in wasteful federal government spending. Now, I've said multiple times, the federal government does not have a revenue problem, it has a spending problem. Now, Director Young, Biden likes to say, show me your budget and I'll tell you your values, so let's see what Democrats really value. The word military appears 26 times in this budget, but gender, it's used 43 times in your budget. Equity, well, that's used 75 times. And climate is used 187 times in this budget. And Americans sure do understand what Democrat priorities are and their values. They know that the real cost of these woke policies and so-called values are impacting them. And the bill has come due for these bad Democrat policies. Proposing to spend trillions of dollars on more woke wants, not needs, is absolutely shameful, and really you should be embarrassed to be testifying today and trying to defend this $5.8 trillion budget. Now, during the State of the Union, Joe Biden said that his plan to fight inflation was for businesses to simply lower their costs, not their wages. Director Young, I'm a small business owner, and I can tell you that that's not how it works in the real world. I understand that we use Washington, D.C. math here, but that's not how it works for real small business owners. Meat is up 13%, milk is up almost 12%, electricity is up 9%. Now, as a restaurant owner, how am I supposed to lower my costs if everything that I use is going up? And I certainly wouldn't be able to pay employees higher wages. So with this skyrocketing inflation that's taking place, Madam Director, can you please simply define to me what inflation is?
Sure, the cost of goods are more expensive. It costs more for the same goods than it did last year. The president is very aware of that. That is why he called on Congress to send him legislation.
Reclaiming my time. Thank you, Director. That's not exactly where I was getting at. Let me answer this for you. So Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, said that inflation comes from too much money being printed in DC. Specifically, and I quote, he said, inflation is a result of too much money and more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output. Moreover, in the modern era, the important next step to recognize that today governments control the quantity of money so that as a result, inflation in the United States is made in Washington and nowhere else. So Director Young, in short, inflation comes from Washington, D.C., where the products we use aren't created, but the products we use are made more expensive. Director Young, shamefully, this Biden budget proposes the largest tax increase in American history, and I really think that bears repeating. It is the largest in American history. The Biden regime either has no concept of how inflation is impacting Americans or simply has no concept for Americans who find the cost of gasoline too expensive because, after all, they can't just go buy a Tesla. How about that for Democrat priorities? Thank you, Madam Director.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. I think I'm the last questioner, and I now yield myself 10 minutes. First of all, let me say thank you for being here, Director Young. I think you have more than justified the judgment of the President to name you to this position and the Senate's wisdom in confirming you. I love going last because it's like cleanup on aisle 6. I get to deal with a lot of the things that have been said and messed up. I'm going to start with Mr. Donald's comment about raising the corporate tax rate. He said if you raise the corporate tax rate, that it's going to cause inflation because they're going to pass it along to consumers. That would imply that if you lowered the tax rate, that they would pass the savings on to consumers. When Republicans cut the tax rate from 35 to 21% in 2017, did that result in any cost cutting for consumers that you're aware of?
It is not.
Right. As a matter of fact, if that were true, we wouldn't have the inflation we have now because they're still paying at a 21% rate. So that just doesn't make sense. And you were here in 2017. You were in the Congress. And the justification the Republicans gave at that time for cutting the corporate tax rate was that this would encourage them to invest in new equipment, new capacity, new productivity. Did any of that happen?
It did not.
No, as a matter of fact, most of the money that was saved by lowering the tax rate was spent on buying back stock and increasing dividends, not in actually increasing it, being reinvested in their businesses. Let's talk about gas prices for a minute. How are gas prices set? What are they dependent upon?
They're dependent on the market.
Right, and it's a global market. Gas is produced all over the world. And when there is higher demand for less gas, prices go up. And conversely, when there's less demand and too much gas, prices go down. I think it was the ranking member, it may not have been, I apologize if I didn't get you right, that said you, back in several years ago, somebody found gas at 90 cents a gallon. And was that during a period when the government was shut down? I mean, the country was shut down, not the government. The country was essentially shut down and nobody was driving.
Right.
Yeah, so prices are naturally going to be lower. And now as the economy is recovering, part of the reason, to forget in the last month or so, which I think we can consider an aberration, we saw a much greater demand for gasoline. Prices went up to a level that basically we've seen before. We saw that level in 2011, 12, 13, 14, and into the Bush administration when gasoline prices were much higher than they were in 2020 and 2021. Well, you mentioned, I think, but the annual production now of gasoline in the United States, the number I saw, which I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, was 12.1 million gallons a day. Russia produces about 10.5 million barrels a day, and Saudi Arabia 8.5 million barrels a day. There's no country on earth that produces as much oil as we are producing right now. So is it fair to say that anything that the Biden administration has proposed or implemented has anything to do with, has had the impact of reducing oil production in the country?
Absolutely not.
Right. And the Keystone Pipeline keeps coming up. The Keystone Pipeline, if it were resumed, if the resumed construction of the Keystone Pipeline today, how long would it be before the Keystone Pipeline was finished?
Not at any time to deal with any of the increases we're seeing now.
I think the estimate's 11 years from now. And somebody mentioned that that was oil that was going to be used in the United States. Is that correct?
I don't believe that's correct, and you pointed to oil production here. Most is shipped other places and not kept here.
Exactly. Let's talk about the Defense Department budget for a minute. The statement's been made, you know, and I know a lot of Republicans are calling for 5% in addition to inflation. Does inflation, the figure that we see now, 7.9% on an annual rate, does inflation affect every entity the same way?
It does not.
So if you're in the Pentagon and you're using a lot of gasoline, you probably are not going to the pump every day and filling up the tanks and the Jeeps and those things. You make contracts for that gasoline, don't you?
That is correct, and you typically lock in a price.
Exactly. And so to say that we automatically have to assume that the Defense Department is going to be, their costs are going to go up 7.9% isn't based on the way things actually work.
We don't believe, we believe this is a real increase.
Right. And one of the things that you're proposing is a 4.6% increase in the salary of military personnel.
Military and civilians.
Civilians, which actually does kind of accommodate the inflation that those military families are experiencing.
It's a part of the formula, actually, that developed the 4.6.
Right. So when the Defense Department analysts were drawing up their budget request, they didn't say that inflation didn't exist, did they?
That's right, and I would like to point out, unlike, I think, some relationships some may have heard between OMB and the departments, OMB and the Department of Defense worked closely hand in hand, and I think the Secretary of Defense would tell you this is the budget he needs to have a ready military.
Again, going back to gas prices for a second, one of the things that came up earlier was a mention of the equity of favoring support for gasoline prices versus support for environmentally beneficial energy sources. And the question was asked, do you think that's fair? Well, personally, I think it's very fair. I mean, I think as a country, there is broad consensus that we need to be moving away from fossil fuels toward renewables and other clean energy sources. But I remember, and I remember when George W. Bush was president, and he said that once gasoline prices get higher than $55 a barrel, that there is no need for incentives for producers to produce. Do you remember that comment?
I do not.
Well, he did. That's getting back a little ways, but and gasoline right now, or oil, is double that amount, yes. Basically $110, $115 a barrel. So according to the man from the biggest oil-producing state in the country, I would say they're not necessary at this point. Talking about the American Rescue Plan, and I think the ranking member said that until the American Rescue Plan was enacted, job growth was performing at a lower rate than had been projected. Is that a fair characterization? You didn't say that? Okay. Well, you said that in the first few months of the Biden administration, job growth was not performing as the projections were. And that was the reason, one of the reasons we passed the American Rescue Plan, to stimulate the economy, to help people get back on their feet. And the fact that we created 6 million jobs after that in 2021 is pretty good evidence that the American Rescue Plan was successful.
And as I mentioned earlier, I sat with Mark Zandi from Moody's yesterday, who believes we would have ended up in a double-dip recession had it not been for ARP. So not only did that not happen, and we're not seeing the scarring we saw after the Great Recession, which took 4 years to recover from, we're seeing record growth out of the pandemic.
And since you mentioned Moody's, a lot of people on the Republican side, none of whom voted for the American Rescue Plan, are trying to lay the 7.9 inflation rate on the money that flowed from the American Rescue Plan. Moody's made an analysis that said that the American Rescue Plan was responsible for less than 1% of that inflation rate. Did they reiterate that to you?
They did.
Do you have any analysis that would contradict them?
I do not.
And the Federal Reserve in San Francisco did a similar analysis and came up with the same result. I think I'm almost done. One question I do have, my 30 seconds left. In considering tax reform, one of the things that a lot of people, including myself, think would be very important and useful and justifiable is to increase the carried interest rate. You don't do that. None of my colleagues, well, at least the leadership of the Ways and Means Committee has not proposed to do that. Is that something the administration has considered, and why has it decided not to approach that, if they've considered it?
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to talk to you about that proposal. I think Treasury is our lead on tax proposals, but I think it's a worthy conversation, and I'm happy to take that offline and have a real conversation about it and tell you if there are concerns, what they are.
Okay, I'd love to hear that. Well, so I'm over my time by 20 seconds, but I've been pretty generous most of the day, so I don't feel guilty about that. But once again, thank you for spending so much time with us. Thank you for your responses. Thank you for your work. And once again, we look forward to continuing to work with OMB as we move forward in this process. Unless there's